Hey, guys, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the ancient Egyptians' most famous botanical party trick, the blue lotus flower. You've probably seen it in tomb paintings, elegant petals usually being sniffed by pharaohs or gently waved around at banquets like an ancient version of cheers. But this flower wasn't just ornament. The Egyptians believed it had sacred properties and mild, psychoactive ones. Yes, the blue lotus could get you just a little bit floaty. The method was simple. Take the dried petals and soak them in wine for a while, sometimes days. Then drink the infusion at festivals, ceremonies, or presumably, whenever you feel like tuning out the sound of 200 people chanting hymns at top volume. The result was a soft, dreamy euphoria. Not enough to make you forget your name, but enough to make pyramid building sound like a fun group project. Now, to be clear, the Egyptians didn't call it getting high. They called it communing with the gods. Blue lotus was strongly associated with rebirth and the sun god Ra, which made it perfect for temple rituals and funerary rites. Holding the flower to one's nose was a symbolic way of inhaling divinity, and okay, maybe also a great way to take the edge off after a long day of ruling the Nile Valley. It was everywhere in art. Pharaohs are shown holding it. Party guests at banquets are passing it around like a floral peace pipe, and even mummies got decorated with it for the afterlife. The thinking seemed to be, if we're traveling to eternity, let's make sure we're stocked up. Practical. But the blue lotus wasn't just ceremonial. Festivals could get wild. And blue lotus infused wine made the music louder, the dancing looser, and the hieroglyphic poetry marginally more profound. Imagine a crowd under the stars sipping lotus wine, feeling as light as a papyrus reed in the breeze. For the ancient Egyptians, that was spiritual fulfillment, and also a very good night. There are religious holidays, and then there's the Feast of Drunkenness, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of saying let's black out in honor of not dying. Subtle name? No. Accurate. Extremely. This annual celebration revolved around the goddess Hathor, who, according to myth, was once sent to punish humanity. But after a bloody spree that would make any disaster movie blush, the gods decided humanity had maybe learned its lesson. So they tricked her into drinking red beer that looked like blood. She passed out and woke up in a better mood. And just like that, mass extinction was narrowly avoided through alcohol poisoning. To commemorate this heroic hangover, the Egyptians gathered once a year to get thoroughly obliterated. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. The goal was to drink until one entered a divine trance. Which sounds poetic until you remember this often meant collapsing face first into a mud brick courtyard surrounded by strangers yelling praises between hiccups. The ritual began at dawn with music, clapping, and the ceremonial passing of drinks. Priests encouraged revelers to drink as much as your heart desires, which in this context was less of a blessing and more of a dare. Participants banged tambourines, danced in the streets, and reportedly saw the goddess, although whether that was Hathor or just the side of a clay jug is unclear. But this wasn't just chaos for chaos's sake. Well, mostly not. The idea was to honor the balance between destruction and joy, reminding everyone that even wrathful deities could be pacified with a strong enough brew. Think of it as theology meets keg stand, and importantly, this was sanctioned behavior. There were no awkward conversations the next day about what happened in the sacred grove. Getting drunk was part of the job description. If anything, not passing out was suspicious. Why aren't you spiritually elevated, Khnumhotep? Do you hate the gods? Modern scholars have described the Feast of Drunkenness as a ritual of renewal. Participants purge their fears, inhibitions, and likely their stomach contents, all in one divinely authorized party. The next day, headaches, regret, possibly a new scar shaped like Anubis, but also spiritual cleansing. Forget everything you know about beer. Ancient Egyptian beer wasn't golden, bubbly, or anything remotely resembling a beverage you'd order at a bar. It was thick, porridge-like, and alarmingly opaque, served with the kind of consistency that would confuse both your bartender and your dentist. Beer for the Egyptians. It was not just a social drink. It was practically a food group made from partially baked loaves of emma bread that were soaked in water, mashed and fermented into a chunky slurry. It resembled a soupy oatmeal more than a refreshing ale. The technical term might be liquid bread, but let's not pretend this wasn't a bowl of carbs in denial. This beer was consumed by everyone: peasants, priests, children, scribes, and anyone else trying to survive in a world where desert heat, crocodiles, and public works projects were daily concerns. It was calorically dense, slightly intoxicating, and cheaper than anything else that didn't require chasing it down with a spear. And here's the twist. Beer wasn't just for sustenance. It was often intentionally altered with herbs, spices, and other curious additives, especially during festivals or religious ceremonies. Want to commune with the gods? Add some mandrake. Want to forget the priest's speech about cosmic order? Toss in a little fermented date juice and hope for the best. Of course, hygiene was a concern, but beer had an answer for that too. Water could kill you, but beer. Beer had been boiled, fermented, and spiced. It was safer than the Nile, and often more reliable than your coworkers. In terms of strength, Egyptian beer ranged from mildly numbing to I forgot how sandals work. While the alcohol content wasn't high by modern standards, the sheer quantity consumed made up for it. Workers on state projects like pyramid building were often paid in beer, a daily ration of several liters, which means that half of ancient Egyptian labor was fueled by liquid gluten and mild intoxication. Let's talk about beer. Or rather, let's talk about a viscous beige bread-adjacent fluid that the ancient Egyptians cheerfully called beer, and that modern brewers would call a war crime. Egyptian beer was less refreshing beverage and more fermented soup with ambition. Made by soaking half-baked loaves of emma bread in water, then mashing the whole affair into a lumpy stew and letting it ferment in open vats, the final product was cloudy, chunky, and distressingly chewable. Imagine oatmeal if oatmeal had opinions and a mild buzz, but despite its texture, which archaeologists generously describe as rustic. This was the drink of the people. Everyone drank it. Pharaohs, priests, peasants, toddlers. Because when water might kill you and milk was suspicious at best, beer was the least deadly option with a pleasant side effect. It was calorie-dense, mildly intoxicating, and often served in communal jugs because nothing says spiritual unity like 5 adults slurping from a pot of soggy breadwater. At temples and festivals, the beer might be enhanced with herbs, dates, honey, or mystery ingredients that were either sacred or just experimental. Historians are still unsure if the addition of mandrake was intentional or if someone was just tired of reality. This was also the go-to payment method for laborers. Pyramid workers didn't clock out with coins. They received daily beer rations, sometimes several liters per day. This means the guys hauling limestone blocks all morning were buzzing and breathing, and somehow the pyramid still got built. Let that sink in the next time you miss a deadline with a cappuccino in hand. Taste probably awful. But if you're living in 1300 BCE, covered in sand and trying not to die of dysentery, a lukewarm jar of beer porridge is Michelin star cuisine. Also, no foam, no carbonation, no glass bottles, just ceramic jugs, straws with filters to catch the bigger bread chunks, and a national commitment to ignoring mouthfeel. Now that you've washed down your bread beer with a floral buzz, it's time to set the mood with smoke. But not just any smoke. We're talking kaifi, the ancient Egyptian incense that made temples smell like divine bakeries and left everyone wondering if they were actually meditating. We're just very, very lightheaded. Kaifi wasn't a quick hit of frankincense. This was the perfumed love child of an apothecary and a pastry chef. Recipes varied by temple, but the ingredients often included myrrh, honey, wine, raisins, cinnamon, juniper, mint, and whatever other spices were lying around not being sacrificed. Mix it all up, let it ferment, and dry it into pellets. And burn them slowly in sacred spaces until everyone either felt deeply spiritual or forgot why they walked in. It was used in ritual purification, which is code for let's fill this room with enough fragrant smoke to erase our sins, or at least our memories of last night's feast of drunkenness. Temples didn't have ventilation, by the way. That was considered breaking the mood. So imagine standing in a limestone cube, next to a sweating priest waving a smoking dish of kafai like it's Febreze for the soul, while a chant drones in Coptic monotone behind you. Visions weren't just encouraged, they were practically inevitable. Whether divine revelation or mild asphyxiation didn't really matter. The gods got their tribute either way. To the Egyptians, Kaphi wasn't just air freshener. It was medicine, perfume, and spiritual elevator all in one. Pliny the Elder later wrote that Kaphi could cure snake bites and improve sleep, which makes sense if you assume the goal was to pass out entirely. Some recipes were so complex they read like ancient IKEA manuals, 16 ingredients, each added in precise phases under specific moons. Honestly, it's a miracle anything got done, but once lit, the aroma drifted across the Nile like a sacred fog machine, signaling that something holy was happening, or that someone was overcompensating for yesterday's fish market. Even in death, Kaphi lingered. It was burned during mummification, buried in tombs, and probably responsible for at least one pharaoh being accidentally embalmed in a spice rub. In short, Kaphi was Egypt's way of saying if you can't drink it, burn it and breathe deeply. If Blue Lotus was Egypt's chill friend, and Kaphi was the drama queen with a smoke machine, then Mandrake was the slightly unhinged guest you invited once and immediately regretted. With its forked roots that vaguely resembled tiny humans and a reputation that scared even seasoned priests, Mandrake was less herbal remedy and more botanical dare, used in ancient Egyptian medicine as both a painkiller and a possible aphrodisiac, which is always a terrifying combination. Mandrake earned its place in temple recipes and medical scrolls with a kind of cautious reverence, usually reserved for wild animals and pharaohs in a bad mood. The Ebers Papyrus, that handy ancient medical text that sounds like it belongs in a Harry Potter class, lists Mandrake for insomnia, fertility, and strengthening the heart, which sounds noble until you remember that the wrong dose could just as easily strengthen your heart into cardiac arrest. See, Mandrake contains alkaloids like scopolamine and atropine, the kind of compounds that mess with your nervous system and occasionally convince you that your bed is melting. In small doses, it was mildly relaxing in slightly bigger ones. Welcome to Night Terrors, starring Array and a crocodile in a wig. And then there's the harvesting myth, according to later folklore, likely inherited from these early associations. Pulling a mandrake root out of the ground caused it to scream loudly, lethally. So naturally, the solution was to tie it to a dog, cover your ears, and let the poor creature yank it free while you hoped your neighbors didn't ask too many questions. While there's no solid evidence the Egyptians were tying plants to dogs and waiting for shrieks, the idea that the plant had spiritual and slightly terrifying power fits right in. Mandrake may have been used in rituals, fertility rites, or just slipped into beer for those who preferred their hallucinations with a rooty aftertaste. In any case, it wasn't the everyday herb. Mandrake was for priests, magicians, and those who didn't mind taking medical advice from a man covered in gold leaf. Used carefully, it could induce sleep, reduce pain, and maybe inspire a sensual poem or two. Used recklessly, you'd wake up 4 days later, convinced you were a scarab beetle. Somewhere in the vast scrolls of Egyptian medical wisdom, wedged between cures for crocodile bites and the proper placement of amulets on inflamed body parts, lies a quiet little mention of Shemshemet. That's right, cannabis. Because when it came to pain relief, the ancient Egyptians didn't just rely on divine intervention or chewing reeds until they forgot their problems. Sometimes they reached for something a little more. Herbal cannabis appears in medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus and Ramesseum Papyrus, mostly as a treatment for inflammation, psoriasis, and various gynecological complaints. Yes, gynecological. Ancient Egyptian women may have had access to THC-infused suppositories, which sound like a modern wellness trend. Someone is definitely going to try to resurrect on Etsy. Of course, the Egyptians didn't roll joints or bake brownies with it, at least. Not that we know of. Cannabis was usually crushed into oils, mixed into salves, or blended with honey. Because if you're going to medicate, why not make it taste nice? Applied topically, it soothed pain. Inhaled accidentally. Well, now the temple incense makes a lot more sense. Was it recreational? Officially, no. Unofficially, probably. When you're running a civilization in 120-degree heat with limited plumbing and a deeply unpredictable crocodile problem, no one blames you for accidentally over-medicating. And if your high priest starts talking to statues a little too confidently, well, who's to say that isn't divine wisdom? There's also physical evidence. Residue analysis from mummies and burial sites has turned up trace amounts of cannabis, along with opium and nicotine, which raises either some fascinating pharmacological questions or the world's most suspicious funeral offerings. And let's not ignore the priests. These were men trained to chant for hours, interpret dreams, and stare into incense smoke until something stared back. If their rituals involved cannabis, it wasn't for giggles. It was to facilitate communication with the gods, or at the very least, with the wall. Somewhere in the dimly lit, sweet-smelling corners of the ancient Egyptian temple pharmacy, just behind the dried lizards and holy ointment sat the opium stash. Small, wrinkled poppy pods imported from the eastern Mediterranean, tucked away like a divine secret. Because when you've got plague, pain, and pyramid-related back injuries, sometimes prayer alone doesn't cut it, though not native to Egypt. Opium poppies likely made their debut through trade with Cyprus or Crete. The Egyptians were nothing if not enthusiastic early adopters. By the time of the New Kingdom, poppies were well on their way to becoming the ancient world's go-to sedative, a medical miracle wrapped in mild addiction. Opium didn't just dull pain, it smoothed over childbirth, calmed coughs, soothed gastrointestinal rage, and made temple chants about cosmic balance feel like they actually had a beat administered in drinks, pills, or occasionally as suppositories. Because, of course, it became the pharmaceutical equivalent of saying, "Shh, don't worry about it." Naturally, it found a home in the temple medicine cabinet, that sacred shelf where healing met holy mystery priests doubling as physicians, administering it during rituals and serious treatments, probably while saying things like, "This will ease the divine tension in your spleen." Whether your god was angry or your molars were, opium could calm them both. The ancient texts don't call it opium directly, of course. That would be too helpful. They reference extracts from the poppy plant in the same vague way modern labels say natural flavors, which is never comforting. But let's not pretend this was all medicinal. There's always a blurry line between spiritual elevation and a really good nap. And for elite Egyptians, especially those being embalmed, opium might have been part of the final send-off. What better way to face the underworld than totally blissed out and blissfully unaware of the scarab beetle crawling across your nose? Like many of Egypt's sacred substances, opium was part cure, part comfort, and part controlled chaos. Used wisely, it soothed agony. Used poorly, it turned temple assistants into spaced-out background dancers. Still, in a world of toothed drills, snakes, and sandstorms, a little somnolent magic went a long way. Wine in ancient Egypt was a sign of sophistication, a drink of the gods, a toast to Osiris. But don't let the elegant amphory fool you. This stuff could hit like a chariot accident, especially when it came laced with the ancient equivalent of a little something extra. Wines weren't just fermented grape juice. They were infusions, concoctions, and occasionally mild experiments in altered consciousness. Egyptians flavored their wine with everything from mandrake and blue lotus to myrrh and frankincense, ingredients that sound spiritual until you realize they were probably added for maximum mood enhancement. Religious festivals were the main setting for these potent potables. At the Feast of Drunkenness, for example, participants didn't sip wine to appreciate terroir. They chugged it to achieve metaphysical disconnection. The idea wasn't to be tipsy, it was to teeter between dimensions, possibly while dancing with a priest in a leopard's skin. These spiked brews were often described in medical texts as remedies, which is how you know things were getting creative. Got a headache? Try a wine infused with fermented lotus. Sore joints. How about some frankincense infused red aged 2 weeks in a clay pot? Existential dread? Well, that one needed priestly supervision and possibly a floor mat. And it wasn't just mortals enjoying this liquid therapy. The gods themselves were believed to appreciate a good spiked offering. Vats of wine were ritually poured out in temples, left as offerings in tombs, and used in ceremonies to help the divine descend into statues, or at least wobble in their general direction. Let's be clear, this wasn't your average table wine. Depending on the additives, these sacred brews could calm nerves, ease pain, or launch a midsummer banquet into full psychedelic mystery cult territory. And because everything was part of a ritual, no one could really question the dosage. If the room spun, it was spiritual. If you passed out in the lotus garden, that was divine communion. For the ancient Egyptians, wine wasn't just a beverage, it was a vehicle, one that could take you to enlightenment, to sleep, or into the arms of a very confused crocodile god. For a civilization obsessed with order, ritual, and geometry, the ancient Egyptians had a surprisingly open mind about trance states. In fact, they encouraged them, just not during accounting. These altered mental states were seen as direct channels to the divine, or at least to some deeply theatrical inner monologue. Possession, divine, not demonic, was often treated as a religious promotion, not a medical emergency if a temple dancer started convulsing mid-routine. She wasn't rushed out by worried acolytes. She was applauded. Hathor had arrived, apparently, and had strong opinions about tambourine tempo. These trances were often achieved through a time-honored combo of repetitive drumming, rhythmic chanting, smoke inhalation, sleep deprivation, and whining with mysterious floaties in it. The result? Sudden bouts of prophecy, dramatic gasping, and the occasional unplanned floor nap. Priests and priestesses alike were trained to host gods like Airbnb guests, welcoming them into their bodies during rituals. This included changes in voice, posture, and a sudden urge to announce cryptic things while staring into a fire. In many temples, it was just another Wednesday. To outsiders, it may have looked like a mass fainting spell, but within the temple, this was how messages from the gods were delivered. Sometimes the gods advised. Sometimes they scolded. Sometimes they demanded more cake offerings, which says a lot about ancient theology and ancient appetites. The trance wasn't always voluntary either. There are accounts of the afflicted being taken by deities, often accompanied by shouting, shaking, and suspicious amounts of incense. Whether these were actual divine messages or simply what happens when you inhale 4 hours of Kifai smoke next to a flaming brazier is still debated. Of course, once the trance ended, the possessed party returned to normal, often looking slightly disoriented and very sweaty. The ritual concluded with applause, a sip of sacred wine, and possibly a nap behind a pillar while someone else mopped up the sanctified drool. To modernize, divine possession might look like performance art meets heat stroke, but to ancient Egyptians, it was the pinnacle of religious experience. The moment when the divine broke through the sandstone barrier of reality to drop a few cryptic life tips. You'd think death would be enough to stop someone from getting invited to a party. Not in ancient Egypt. The line between the living and the dead was more of a soft suggestion, like don't swim after eating, or maybe don't chisel hieroglyphs drunk. Egyptians didn't just respect the dead, they actively included them in social plans. This wasn't metaphorical. Families visited tombs during festivals like the beautiful Feast of the Valley, lugging baskets of food, jugs of beer, and the general vibe of a tailgate party. If the tailgate was parked in a necropolis, they'd sit outside the tomb, eat, drink, and commune with the deceased, which usually meant talking to the wall and hoping grandma appreciated the pickled fish. Many tombs had false doors, carved portals through which the dead could receive offerings. Whether this meant spiritually or just enjoying the smell from the other side is unclear. Either way, ancient Egyptians believed the dead could still enjoy food, drink, music, and a decent bit of gossip. So naturally, they threw them parties. Music was played, incense was burned, libations were poured. Sometimes the living got drunk enough to cry, confess secrets, or accidentally sit on sacred offerings. It was like a family reunion, only with fewer arguments and slightly more embalming fluid. These gatherings weren't just acts of remembrance. They were also mutually beneficial transactions. The living fed the dead. The dead, in theory, blessed the living in return. Good crops, protection, fewer nightmares involving hippos. Everyone won. Sometimes people even slept overnight in tombs, hoping for dream visions from their departed loved ones, or the occasional unsolicited advice from a former accountant turned ghost. Stop lending money to your brother, the dream might say, and also the amulets go on the left. To modern sensibilities, this sounds macabre. To the Egyptians, it was completely logical. The afterlife wasn't a goodbye, it was just a new address. And if Great Uncle Hormheb wanted to attend the party via divine osmosis through a stonewall, who were they to say no? For all the incense, holy trances, and sanctioned debauchery, ancient Egyptian revelry came with a price. It usually arrived sometime around sunrise with a pounding headache and the vague memory of yelling at a statue. Yes, even in a world where Blue Lotus was medicine and beer was breakfast, the morning after hit just as hard. Archaeological texts are suspiciously quiet on the subject of hangovers, which is probably because no one was in the mood to write hieroglyphs when their head felt like it had been smited by Ra himself. But the evidence is there. Medical papyri describe pains of the head and recommend treatments involving herbs, honey, and sometimes just lying very still while pretending to commune with the gods. In more advanced cases, a ritual cleansing was recommended, which usually involved a priest, a bucket of cold Nile water, and possibly a stern lecture on moderation that no one remembered hearing. The real trick, of course, was plausible deniability. If you danced shirtless in a temple or passed out in a tomb alcove, you didn't say I overdid it. You said I was overcome by the divine. It wasn't a blackout. It was a mystical encounter with Hathor's laughter, much more respectable, and for the truly unlucky. There's always purging, not metaphorically, literally. The Egyptians were fond of emetics, lovely concoctions designed to evacuate your sins from both ends. Imagine being handed a drink that tastes like regret and being told this will restore your balance. Moments later, your balance is definitely gone. The priests, of course, fared better. They had training, they had ritual authority, and most importantly, they had people to carry them home. Meanwhile, common revelers woke up with lotus petals in their hair and sandal imprints on their faces, wondering whether they danced with a god or just someone very committed to the role. Still, no one swore off the next celebration because spiritual enlightenment, as it turns out, is addictive, especially when it comes with beer, smoke, and a mild chance of falling into a trance and yelling your neighbor's secrets in front of a statue. When ancient Egyptians prepared for death, they didn't just pack linens and a decent eulogy. They packed snacks and drugs and possibly a backup stash, just in case eternity got boring. Because if you thought the partying stopped after your heart was weighed, think again. It just moved underground. Tombs weren't silent, solemn places. They were carefully curated starter homes for the soul, complete with food, booze, and mood-enhancing herbal arrangements. Mummies were entombed with blue lotus petals, wine jugs, incense cones, and the occasional sealed mystery jar, which archaeologists now eye with both reverence and mild suspicion. Take Tutankhamun, for example. When Howard Carter cracked open his tomb, he didn't just find gold and furniture. He found wine, oils, and herbs, and what can only be described as the ancient Egyptian version of a wellness kit. If a modern influencer were buried today, it would look disturbingly similar, minus the canopic jars. This wasn't just luxury, it was strategic. The soul or bar, if you're fancy, needed nourishment and stimulation in the afterlife. Eternal bliss wasn't going to maintain itself after all. So priests and embalmers made sure you were entombed with all your spiritual comfort items, food offerings, sacred perfume, and a generous dose of whatever got you through long temple ceremonies while pretending to be enlightened. Some tombs even include instructions to the dead on how to prepare and enjoy these items in the afterlife. It's not enough to carry Blue Lotus into eternity. Apparently, you also needed directions in case divine short-term memory was a thing. And let's not forget the opening of the mouth ritual, which was supposed to let the dead eat, speak, and let's be honest, sip that sacred fermented beverage with proper technique, because it's hard to toast Osiris with a closed jaw. All of this tells us one very clear thing. The ancient Egyptians did not separate pleasure from piety. If something brought them closer to the gods in life, even if it was a psychoactive flower soaked in wine, it belonged in the tomb, along with your amulets, your linen headrest, and possibly a starter pack of dreams. Ancient Egypt gave the world pyramids, mummies, and eyeliner that could block out the sun, but it also perfected an unspoken truth of civilization. Sometimes the people running things are just high enough to think it's going well. Officially, the pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of Horus, chosen by the gods to maintain cosmic order. Unofficially, temple priests had the keys to the sacred stash, the incense budget, and the daily schedule of who gets to chant next to a burning bush of Kai-Fi until they pass out. The religious elite weren't just spiritual guides, they were state-sanctioned pharmacists, supplying the population with everything from calming ointments to full-blown psychedelic experiences disguised as Holy Communion if it smelled strong, tingled on contact, or made you speak in metaphor for 3 days. It probably came out of the priesthood's apothecary. And while pharaohs wore the crowns, it was the priests who knew how to blend mandrake with wine and not kill anyone. This gave them an enormous amount of soft power, not just in healing and ritual, but in managing the emotional and mystical tone of society. You didn't ask what's going on with the harvest. You asked, what did the high priest see in his trance last night? Spoiler. It was usually a falcon and a lot of swirling gold light. Let's not forget the economic side. The temples were landowners, employers, and massive centers of drug production. Blue Lotus didn't grow itself. Someone had to harvest it, dry it, ferment it, and whisper to it in sacred verse. So yes, religion was very holy, but it was also a well-oiled machine. One that ran on faith, herbs, and occasionally mind-altering doses of divine inspiration. In many ways, the question of who ruled Egypt was less about crowns and more about who controlled the incense burners. Because if the gods spoke through visions and the visions came after a priest sniffed something pungent in a sealed chamber, well, you do the math. In theory, ancient Egypt was all about balance, justice, and order. In practice, if you were rich enough to afford a private tomb and someone to fan you while you digested, you also had access to the good stuff, the kind of narcotic rarities that didn't show up in the village clinic scrolls. Make no mistake, ancient Egyptian society was a hierarchy, and mind-altering substances followed the same rules as everything else. Pharaoh at the top, goat herder at the bottom, and everyone else politely sniffing dried flowers and pretending it was enough. While commoners got barley beer and maybe a whiff of temple incense if they leaned close enough, the elite were bathing in blue lotus oil and sipping spiked pomegranate wine out of gold-rimmed chalices. Some of the more potent substances, Mandric Kafai blends laced with opium imported cannabis resins, were likely restricted to ritual or medical use, which just happened to align perfectly with the daily schedules of court officials and high priests. Funny how that worked out. Take Pharaoh himself. The divine ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt couldn't be expected to process the metaphysical weight of ruling without a little help from the sacred pharmacopoeia. If his dreams were considered state messages from the gods, then sedating his insomnia with a psychoactive nightcap was an indulgence. It was national security. Even in death, the elite kept their stash close. Many tombs contained medicinal vials, incense cones, and wine jars with labels so vague they may as well have read for ceremonial purposes only. One wonders if the gods actually required that much imported poppy resin, or if Tutankhamun just liked to keep his options open. Meanwhile, the lower classes weren't exactly locked out of the experience. They just had to settle for the watered-down versions. Beer thick enough to chew, weak incense, and whatever passed for spiritual euphoria during an 18-hour shift building obelisks. And when someone did get their hands on a forbidden substance without a permit, that was likely called witchcraft, heresy, or a very bad day to be a field laborer. After 14 chapters of sacred snorting, divine date drinking, and hallucinogenic healthcare, one might be tempted to ask what all this really says about ancient Egypt. Well, for starters, it tells us they were brilliant at blending science, spirituality, and recreational chemistry into a single belief system. Pain, relief, and prophecy came from the same flower. Medicine and mysticism walked hand in hand, usually to the beat of a system and the smell of something smoldering that definitely wasn't FDA approved. It also reveals just how much the ancients respected the power of altered states, not as escapism, but as a legitimate way to access insight healing, and the occasional god with an animal head and a flair for drama. Their rituals weren't just pageantry. They were controlled by chemical theater with incense, chanting, and psychotropic tea for the caste, and strict gatekeeping of sacred substances. That's just the ancient version of putting wellness behind a paywall. The elite had their blue lotus spas and imported opium. Everyone else got lukewarm beer and an eye infection. Divine enlightenment was available, but only if you could afford the luxury tomb package with optional afterlife minibar. But perhaps the most revealing takeaway is this. Humans have always wanted to feel more, see more, and know more, especially if it involves lying down in a temple and not doing chores. The ancient Egyptians weren't that different from modern humans meditating with essential oils or arguing about microdosing on podcasts. They just wore more eyeliner and took their hallucinations more seriously. So what does this mean for us? Well, maybe that our ancestors weren't primitive drug enthusiasts or eccentric spiritualists. Maybe they were just doing their best to navigate a confusing, beautiful, often painful world with the tools, rituals, and fragrant smoke they had. And if that journey to inner peace happened to involve wine, wildflowers, and a trance where you barked like Anubis, so be it. Florence. Late 1400s. The air was thick with incense, sweat, and the perfume of crushed roses. The city was bursting with art, intellect, and political intrigue, but also a very specific kind of madness. The obsession with beauty. And not just any beauty. Renaissance beauty. The kind that meant looking like a porcelain statue even if it killed you. Enter Sarasa, a luxurious, silky white face paint made from, you guessed it, lead. Yes, actual lead. Women across Florence, Venice, and beyond smear this shimmering poison across their cheeks, foreheads, and décolletage to achieve that ultra-pale, ethereal look. Because in a world where tan skin meant laboring under the sun like a peasant, looking like a walking cadaver was the ultimate flex. But this wasn't just a light dusting of powder. No, Sarissa was layered on like Venetian stucco. Some women went so far as to sleep in it, refusing to wash their faces, allowing the toxic compound to literally soak into their skin. The result? A radiant, ghostly glow, right up until the sores appeared. And when they did, they just applied more lead to cover them. You know, like a Renaissance Band-Aid. One that guaranteed the wound would never heal. If the lead didn't get you, the mercury might. Used to treat blemishes and fade sunspots, mercury was another charming element in the Renaissance beauty arsenal. Combine that with arsenic-based tonics and vinegar face baths, and you had a full-blown chemical warfare routine, marketed as elegance. And let's not forget the classism baked into every powdered pore. Noble women wanted their skin to look untouched by sunlight or hardship, so the paler the better, even if it made them anemic, delirious, or eventually dead. Looking divine came at a divine cost, but perhaps the most ironic part. The women who could afford all this toxic luxury also had access to imported perfumes from the Orient, rosewater distillations, and camphor lace tonics. They literally smelled like angels, while their skin peeled off in sheets. If you had a functioning pair of eyebrows in Renaissance Florence, you clearly weren't trying hard enough. In the never-ending quest to resemble a Botticelli painting or a particularly fashionable egg, Renaissance women plucked their hairlines and eyebrows into oblivion. A high, rounded forehead was considered the epitome of beauty. The higher your forehead, the more noble and intelligent you appeared. So women willingly yanked out rows of hair from their brows and along their hairline with tweezers, rough cloth, or even seashells. This wasn't a one-time affair. It was routine maintenance, a weekly ritual of pain and precision. For stubborn hairs, women rubbed in concoctions made from walnut oil or cat dung. Yes, cat dung to thin the regrowth. Some even scorched stray hairs off with candle flames. Because nothing says grace and refinement like lighting your face on fire. Eyebrows thin, arched, and barely visible, if at all. A truly sophisticated woman had no visible brows. Instead, a soft shadow or trace was painted in later, often with burnt cork or powdered charcoal, which sounds elegant until you realize it smeared terribly in the Florentine heat. Imagine your eyebrows slowly dripping down your cheeks during Mass. Divine. Meanwhile, body hair was seen as animalistic and unclean. Women removed it with a paste made from vinegar, quick lime, and arsenic, another charming blend. The mixture burned, but hey, it left the skin smooth until it didn't. And the scalp hair was gathered up into tight, rigid styles, often braided and padded with false hair made from wool horse hair, or someone else's actual hair. Sometimes hairpieces were soaked in lye and bleach to match the fashionable golden hue of the season. If it didn't match, no worries. Just wear a cap over it and pretend it did. Renaissance problem solving at its finest. The irony? All this hair removal and sculpting was done without mirrors. That's right, mirrors were rare and expensive. Most women style themselves by feel with help from servants. So your maid better have steady hands and zero passive aggression. One wrong move and your widow's peak becomes a monk's tonsure. Renaissance beauty was less about natural charm and more about strategic subtraction. Remove the brows, remove the hairline, remove common sense, all in the name of elegance. Once the face had been thoroughly powdered, plucked, and poisoned, it was time to move on to the body. Specifically, squeezing it into shapes the human ribcage had no business aspiring to. Enter the Renaissance corset, equal parts fashion statement and orthopedic trauma. Renaissance corsets weren't quite the wasp-waisted death traps of later centuries, but they still meant business. Known as stays or bodies, these early versions were designed to flatten the torso, not cinch it. The goal was to create a smooth, rigid canvas that emphasized the bust and elongated the silhouette. Because what's sexier than looking like a very elegant plank? The stiffening materials? Whalebone if you were rich, reeds or pasteboard if you weren't. All of it sewn into linen and laced tightly across the back. Getting into one required assistance, determination, and a surprising tolerance for losing peripheral vision. A fully dressed noblewoman was essentially an armored artichoke, layered, spiked, and strangely delicate. And corsets weren't just about looks, they were moral statements. A straight, upright posture indicated inner virtue. Slouching, on the other hand, suggested moral laxity and possibly demonic possession. So if you were a well-bred lady, you stood straight, walked stiffly, and breathed in short, shallow gasps. Bonus points. If you fainted gracefully in public, that just meant you were doing it right. Underneath linen chemises helped absorb sweat because newsflash Florence. Summer was not a place for heavy fabrics and no airflow, but elegance came first. Comfort came never. And yet, despite the discomfort, corsets had one major benefit. They held everything in place. Unlike modern bras that pretend to offer support while staging a quiet rebellion by noon, Renaissance stays offered the kind of structural reinforcement usually reserved for bridges. You could run, dance, or survive a fainting spell without anything shifting an inch. Of course, not everyone could afford such architectural fashion. Working-class women went without stays, favoring looser bodices and more breathable materials. But among the elite, corsets were essential. You weren't fully dressed without one, just tragically undone. The worst part, you had to eat while wearing one. Which brings us to the next Renaissance fashion paradox. Feasting like royalty while trying not to split a seam or collapse from restricted airflow. In Renaissance Italy, beauty wasn't just skin deep. It extended all the way to the dinner table, where fashion and food had an uneasy relationship. On the one hand, noble women were expected to attend lavish banquets and engage in the social theater of feasting. On the other hand, they had to do it while squeezed into a corset so tight their internal organs were basically roommates. Meals were grand affairs. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted peacock, marzipan sculptures, and gilded fruit. But for upper-class women, actually eating was a delicate performance. You could nibble, you could sip, but you absolutely could not unhinge your jaw and go to town on a goose leg. That would have been barbaric and potentially dangerous given the burning in your bodice. Instead, you were expected to take dainty bites, keep your back straight, and smile through the growing pressure in your ribs. Sometimes the act of sitting upright for hours and pretending to enjoy cold eel pie was enough to trigger a fainting spell, which, frankly, only added to the aesthetic. Pale, breathless, and collapsing into the arms of a handsome courtier. Très chic. Of course, this polite self-starvation had limits. Many noble women were secretly ravenous by the time they reached their private chambers, where they could finally remove the corset and devour a hidden stash of sweetmeats or leftover cheese. Yes, even Renaissance beauty queens had midnight snacks. They just couldn't admit it. And there were rules even for those. Certain foods were believed to affect the complexion. Cucumbers were discouraged. They made the skin watery. Wine was encouraged. It flushed the cheeks with color. Some ladies even drank vinegar tonics to stay trim, because nothing says high fashion like ruining your gut lining. There was also the matter of digestion. In a corset, your stomach had nowhere to go. Women had to pace their eating carefully or risk indigestion, bloating, or, God forbid, a very unladylike burp with the horror. So while men got to recline, drink heavily, and argue about Dante, women mastered the art of elegant restraint, eating just enough to seem sociable, but never enough to ruin the line of their gown. Once the face was painted, the hair plucked, the corset tightened, and the food politely nibbled, it was time to smell expensive. In Renaissance Florence, your scent wasn't just a finishing touch, it was a social weapon. A noblewoman's fragrance was as carefully curated as her lineage, and failing to smell like imported luxury was basically a scandal. The Renaissance nose had standards. Common folk might reek of garlic, goat, and existential dread, but the elite? They wafted through salons and basilicas, trailing clouds of rose water, musk, ambergris, and exotic spices. If you walked past a duchess and didn't feel mildly intoxicated by her scent, she wasn't trying hard enough. Perfume was big business. Italy, especially Venice, was the European hub for distillation, but the most coveted ingredients came from farther afield. Frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Ethiopia, cinnamon from Ceylon, and ambergris, a waxy, oddly pleasant-smelling substance from the intestines of sperm whales. It was outrageously expensive and wildly fashionable. Basically the Renaissance equivalent of dabbing yourself with designer whale baths. These perfumes weren't just for pulse points. They were soaked into gloves, stitched into dress linings, and sprayed onto handkerchiefs that ladies would flutter dramatically whenever someone less hygienic came too close, which was often. The streets were filthy. People bathed irregularly. Perfume wasn't a luxury, it was armor, and for the ambitious beauty, scent layering was essential. First came the scented bath, usually a rinse of rose water or camphor. Then a dusting of crushed violet petals, followed by an oil rubbed into the temples or wrists, and finally a heavy mist of whatever concoction your apothecary swore would make men weep and rivals faint. Some even wore pomanders, delicate perforated orbs filled with aromatic herbs around the neck or waist. Others dangled them from their belts like olfactory warning bells. Approach with caution. I smell of cinnamon and judgment. But these potions weren't always benign. Some perfumes contained turpentine, or tinctures so strong they could trigger headaches, nausea, or fainting. One wrong blend, and you went from seductive to insufferable. Still, the right fragrance could open doors, or at least noses. A woman who smelled divine had power. Power to entrance, distract, or just to survive a crowd of unwashed poets if Renaissance beauty was a battlefield. Then fashion was the armor, and Florence was its glittering war zone. The fabric you wore didn't just say something about you. It screamed. It sang. It flounced down the street, declaring your family's wealth, your husband's rank, and whether or not you had any shame in bankrupting him for a sleeve. Velvet was the crown jewel. Imported, dyed, and woven with the kind of care usually reserved for saints' relics, velvet was thick, heavy, and absurdly expensive. Wearing it in summer. A true power move. You were hot, yes, but you were important. Then came brocade. Not content with mere color, brocade brought patterns into the picture. Lions, vines, even entire religious scenes woven in gold thread. And we're not talking about subtle accents. These were gowns that could double as altarpieces. The more intricate the design, the more time and money it took. Which meant the more smugly you could nod at other women's inferior sleeves. Sleeves, by the way, were detachable. A practical feature turned into a competitive sport. Wealthy women owned entire wardrobes of sleeves to mix and match, flaunting them like today's designer handbags. Embroidered, puffed, slashed, pearl-encrusted, some sleeves were so elaborate they needed their own storage system and occasionally their own servants. Colors were coded, too. Deep blues and crimsons were made with rare dyes like lapis lazuli and cochineal pigments, so expensive they were locked away like treasure. Only the rich could afford these hues, and sumptuary laws in places like Florence tried and failed to restrict certain colors to the nobility. But laws are boring. Dresses were not. Even the underlayers were ornate. Chemises were trimmed with lace. Petticoats peeked out in silken flashes, and girdles, belt-like accessories, weren't just decorative. Some were studded with gems and hidden pockets for perfume, prayer books, or possibly revenge notes. But all this fashion came at a price. Literally, a single gown could cost more than a year's wages for a craftsman. And yet noble women didn't just have these gowns. They needed them. Every social event was a stage and every outfit a statement. Wearing the same thing twice? Social suicide. Renaissance fashion didn't stop at the ankle, though in fairness, no one was really supposed to see your ankles. Modesty dictated that a woman's feet be kept decently hidden beneath layers of brocade and silk, which was a pity. considering how completely ridiculous Renaissance footwear often was. Let's start with the Chopin, the most theatrical shoe ever invented. Chopins were essentially high platform soles. Think ancient Roman sandals crossed with stilts. Originally from Venice, they were designed to keep fine dresses above the muddy, plague-infested streets. But over time, function gave way to fashion, and Chopin got taller. Much taller. Some were over 20 inches high. Yes, that's not a typo. 20 inches. Wearing them required balance, training, and frequently a servant on each arm. Walking unaided was considered both a physical feat and a social risk. If you fell, you didn't just lose your dignity. You might take out half the wedding party with you. In Florence, Chopins weren't quite as extreme, but the trend still trickled down. Wealthy women wore delicate pointed slippers, often made of velvet, embroidered with silk thread and lined with fur. These were indoor shoes. Outdoors, you wore patterns, wooden or cork platforms strapped underneath your slippers to protect them from the street. A practical solution, unless you tripped and shattered your kneecaps on cobblestones. Foot binding wasn't a thing in Renaissance Italy, but the pressure to have dainty, narrow feet absolutely was. Shoes were pointed, narrow, and not built for actual walking. But who needed to walk when you could glide from sedan chair to palace hall, leaving a trail of crushed flower petals and broken arches? And then there were the stockings. Women wore finely knit hose made of silk or wool tied at the knee with ribbons. These ribbons were sometimes scented because if someone caught a glimpse of your shin, you at least wanted to smell fabulous. Of course, lower-class women wore simpler shoes, sturdy leather for labor, clogs for wet work, but the noble class treated footwear like a secret weapon on sea. Impractical and incredibly expensive. All of it reinforced a single message. Real ladies didn't walk. They floated. They glided. They suffered gracefully and in style. After hours of being powdered, plucked, laced, perfumed, stuffed, and platformed, what came next? That's right, dancing. Because nothing completes the Renaissance beauty ritual like trying to glide across a polished marble floor in 20 pounds of fabric and 2 inches of breathable lung space. Courtly dances were serious business. These weren't your carefree, tavern-style reels. No, Renaissance court dances were slow, elegant, and excruciatingly choreographed. Every step was rehearsed, every movement symbolic. The wrong foot placement could imply social ineptitude. A misstep. Scandalous. You might as well shout "I own nothing" in lapis lazuli and run barefoot into the Arno. For noblewomen, dancing was a test of composure. The most popular forms, like the pavane or the galliard, required gliding in precise patterns, keeping your gaze modest, and never, under any circumstance, breathing through your mouth. That was considered undignified, which is unfortunate, because corsets did not allow for deep breaths. Every galliard leap was a calculated gamble against passing out cold, and yet it was crucial. A woman's grace on the dance floor was as vital to her reputation as her dowry. Parents hired dance tutors the way modern influencers hire lighting designers. You learned how to turn, how to bow, how to fan yourself just enough to be mysterious, but not so much that you looked sweaty. The goal was to radiate effortless control, even as your shoes blistered and your ribs whimpered. There was also the matter of social strategy. Dancing offered rare opportunities to interact briefly with eligible men. Gloved hands touched for a moment, eyes met during a bow, perfumes mingled. It was flirtation with footnotes. But say too much, move too boldly, or heaven forbid, laugh. You risked ruining your entire aesthetic of pious elegance. Meanwhile, the background noise of every court event was a choir of judgment. Other women critiqued your gown, your hairstyle, your posture. Servants whispered, tutors fretted, and all the while you had to maintain the illusion that none of it mattered. But it did. A clumsy turn or an off-rhythm curtsy could haunt you for weeks. So you danced. You smiled. You endured, and when the music finally stopped, you excused yourself to repowder your sweat-streaked sarissa before round 2. The guest had departed. The candles had melted into waxy puddles, and the Renaissance noblewoman, divine, dazzling, and delicately dying inside, finally made it back to her chambers. But sleep? Not yet. First came the Renaissance version of the night routine. Spoiler alert. It was less self-care and more controlled deterioration. Step 1. The unmasking. Out came the linen cloths, rose water, and raw egg whites. The lead-based sarasa had to be gently removed, not because it was delicate, but because scrubbing too hard would take skin with it. Many women used a mix of almond oil and vinegar to lift the layers, hoping their complexion underneath wasn't too ravaged. Spoiler. It usually was. Then came the hair, or what was left of it. Carefully, the pins and fake braids were uncoiled. Any adhesive used to keep forehead wigs in place had to be dissolved with herbal tonics. Ladies hoped the cat dung and quicklime they used for hair removal earlier in the week hadn't left bald patches. No pressure. Next, the corset unlacing, a spiritual experience, one that usually involved gasping, groaning, and possibly an audible crunch as ribs regained their original shape. Women could finally breathe. Not deeply, but enough to sigh in relief and maybe whisper never again for the 100th time. The feet were peeled out of slippers, revealing the crushed remains of what used to be toes. If you were lucky, your servant brought a basin of warm water with lavender or rosemary to soak them. If not, you just stared at your feet and wondered if you'd ever feel joy again. Finally, you were rubbed down with sweet oils. Or if you were particularly devout or paranoid, an alchemical tonic promising to preserve your youth. Never mind that it smelled like old copper and probably contained powdered beetles. Beauty is pain, also possibly pestilence. And then, at last, the candle was blown out. Not with a huff. Still too improper, but a delicate puff, like you were apologizing to the flame. You lay back, hairline 2 inches farther back than it was last year, skin slightly more ghostly than the day before, lungs recovering from corset trauma. But tomorrow you do it all again. Because in Renaissance Florence, beauty wasn't just a look, it was a lifestyle. A full-time, high-stakes performance with no intermission. And the audience. Everyone. Before Irizumi became linked to crime syndicates and back alley parlors, tattoos in Japan carried a far more complex and layered identity, one deeply rooted in honor, mythology, and labor. Long before the Edo period, Japanese tattoos were used as punitive marks, burned or etched into criminals' faces and arms to permanently brand them as outcasts. But by the 1600s, these crude symbols had evolved into something far more intricate, something closer to art, devotion, and even spiritual armor. In Edo, Japan, society was rigidly structured. Class divisions were clear. Samurai had swords. Merchants had rules. Everyone else? They had restrictions. The Tokugawa shogunate enforced strict codes on dress and behavior, especially for the lower classes. Ornate robes, luxurious fabrics, and flashy jewelry were reserved for the elite. But human nature always finds a loophole. For the common man, especially laborers, firemen, and gamblers, tattoos became a way to reclaim beauty, status, and identity. If you couldn't wear brocade on the outside, why not wear it on your skin? And so full-body tattoos flourished underground, hidden beneath plain work clothes, but revealed in bathhouses, festivals, and moments of intimacy. These weren't random designs. They were stories, sleeves of swirling dragons, bodysuits of phoenixes, koi fish, cherry blossoms, Buddhist deities, and folkloric heroes. Each tattoo carried meaning. A koi swimming upstream symbolized perseverance. A dragon on the back meant power and protection. These motifs weren't chosen on a whim. They were earned, sometimes one painful inch at a time, and the process was brutal. There were no machines, no antiseptic creams. Artists called Herscher used wooden handles and steel needles to hand-poke ink beneath the skin. The ink was often mixed with charcoal or natural pigments, hammered in using rhythmic strikes. Sessions lasted hours. Full bodysuits could take years, but the result? A living mural that turned skin into storytelling. Yet despite their cultural richness, tattoos remained illegal for much of the Edo period. Authorities viewed them as signs of disorder, deviance, or wastefulness. And so the art of Irizumi thrived in the shadows, respected by some, feared by others, and completely invisible to the ruling elite. In Edo period Japan, where wooden buildings were packed like kindling and open flames lit every lantern, fires were constant and devastating. The samurai might have ruled the land, But when your neighborhood caught fire, it was the fireman, Hiker, who saved your life. These weren't firemen as we imagine today. They didn't use hoses or wear flame retardant suits. Instead, they carried hooks, axes, and raw courage. Their job wasn't to extinguish fires. It was to tear down nearby structures and create fire breaks before the flames could spread. This meant climbing onto burning rooftops and dismantling homes by hand, often while embers rained from the sky. Naturally, these men developed a culture of bravado, toughness, and brotherhood, and central to that culture was tattooing. Full-body tattoos. Irizumi Horomono became a badge of honor among the Haikishi. Not only were they stunning displays of strength and endurance, they were deeply symbolic dragons for power, tigers for courage, gods and demons for spiritual protection. When a fireman stripped off his uniform to reveal a full suit of swirling ink, it wasn't vanity, it was armor. And the pain? It was part of the point. Sitting for hundreds of hours while needles punctured the skin was a rite of passage. If you could endure that, you could face down an inferno. The tattoos weren't just decoration. They were proof of fearlessness, commitment, and pain endured for the good of the group. Some crews even shared themes with all members, sporting similar motifs to reflect unity. You'd see entire teams marked with identical dragons across their backs, or coordinated waves and blossoms swirling down their arms. This wasn't gang behavior. It was solidarity, brotherhood forged through smoke and fire. But it wasn't legal. Tattoos were still frowned upon by the authorities, seen as vulgar or wasteful, especially for public servants. So the Hiker wore their ink beneath their clothes, only revealed in private bathhouses or celebratory festivals where their role as local heroes gave them a pass, at least temporarily. Ironically, these same men were admired in their neighborhoods and feared by the elite. Their tattoos were marks of danger to some, of devotion to others. Beyond the fire brigades and labor crews, another group embraced the painful elegance of Irizumi, the gamblers, rogues, and thrill-seekers of Edo's underground. These were the drifters of the Ukiyo, the floating world, a term that described both the pleasure quarters and the transient nature of existence itself. And in that fleeting world, tattoos were a language of risk, identity, and rebellion. Many of these men were bakudo, professional gamblers who roamed the country with dice, cards, and an uncanny ability to separate samurai from their stipends. While the bakudo had no formal organization at first, they lived by their own codes of loyalty, honor, and toughness. In a society that relegated them to the fringes, tattoos became a way to reclaim dignity, to turn a marginal life into one of meaning, one needle prick at a time. Their tattoos were bold, provocative, and unapologetically visible in the right settings. Peonies, fierce warriors, gods of fortune, and snakes slithered across their torsos. These weren't the quiet, contemplative inkings of monks or the civic pride of firemen. These were power statements, visual declarations that said, "I don't follow your rules. I live on my own." Many designs referenced famous characters from Japanese folklore and kabuki theater, heroes like Sakata Kintoki, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, or even mythical rebels who challenge authority. The more outrageous the figure, the more admired the tattoo. It wasn't just skin-deep symbolism, it was branding in a society where no one handed you a name unless you fought for it. And yet, despite their outsider status, these men were crucial to the underground economy. They lent money, maintained order in red light districts, and developed early proto-Yakuza structures. Their tattoos became both a badge and a warning: loyalty within, danger without. Tattooing shops flourished in this world, not always marked with signs, but known through whispers and connections. The Horishi became revered figures, their work whispered about in bathhouses and behind sake counters. To be inked by a famous master was an honor to endure the hours of stabbing pain, a show of grit. For gamblers and rogues, Irizumi was more than art. It was an identity carved in pain, proudly worn in a world that had no place for them. Though tattooing in Edo, Japan is often portrayed as a masculine tradition of laborers, firefighters, and gamblers, women also left their mark, sometimes quite literally, on this hidden world of ink. While rarely documented in official records, female tattoos existed quietly, tenderly, and rebelliously beneath the layers of silk and propriety. In many cases, these tattoos were intimate, romantic, and personal. Unlike the large mythological bodysuits of their male counterparts, women's tattoos were often smaller, discreet, and emotionally charged. Lovers would tattoo each other's names on hidden parts of their bodies, inside the upper arm, on the inner thigh, near the collarbone. A gesture known as Irizumi Chobon, love tattoos. A popular phrase inked onto women's skin was Enochi Azukamasu, meaning I entrust you with my life. It was more than a vow. It was a declaration of emotional surrender, written in pain. Men sometimes carried similar inscriptions, showing mutual commitment beyond what any formal wedding could offer. This kind of tattooing was especially common among lovers in the ukiyo, the floating world of pleasure districts where courtesans and geisha reigned. Among high-ranking courtesans, tattoos were sometimes a tool of seduction. A small teasing mark, visible only when a robe slipped just right, became part of the mystique. It gave the illusion of intimacy, as if a client was seeing something forbidden. In reality, the tattoo may have been shared with dozens of clients, each believing it was a private secret. In other cases, tattoos signified heartbreak or betrayal. The courtesan might burn or slash a name tattooed on her body after a lover abandoned her, turning passion into scarred testimony. Some even covered these names with new ink, dragons swallowing letters, waves washing away memories. But for women outside the pleasure quarters, tattoos could also be acts of quiet rebellion. Peasant women, fisher women, or wives of tattooed men sometimes followed suit, inspired by the artistry or solidarity. Though they risked judgment, these women wore their ink privately under their robes as silent declarations of autonomy, while Edo society officially condemned such markings, especially on women. These tattoos carved out a hidden narrative, one of love, agency, and pain born voluntarily, a story the official histories never bothered to write down. Behind every breathtaking bodysuit, every swirling dragon and tragic hero etched in flesh, there stood the unsung artisans of Edo, Japan, the horishi or tattoo masters. They worked quietly in tucked away corners of the city. Anonymous rooms above tea houses, back rooms of barbershops, or candle-lit apartments that smelled of incense and ink. There were no flashing signs, no customer reviews, just reputation passed by word of mouth and ink skin. Becoming a horishi was no casual decision. It took years of training, usually through apprenticeship under a master. The tools were basic wooden handles with clusters of steel needles at the tip, dipped into a thick black ink called sumi, made from soot and animal glue. The technique? Painstakingly slow and deeply painful. The needles were jabbed rhythmically into the skin by hand, often with a bamboo mallet. This process, called tabori, required steady hands, infinite patience, and the mental endurance of a monk. But Harishir weren't just craftsmen. They were storytellers, historians, psychologists. A good tattoo master had to understand not only how to tattoo, but what to tattoo. Every design carried meaning. The cherry blossom fading into waves, the transience of life, a tiger climbing a mountain, bravery in the face of impossible odds. The client might bring a request, but the horishi would decide the placement, the balance, and the soul of the piece. Clients would return over and over, sometimes for years, to complete their full suit, a bodyscape that stretched from shoulder to thigh, across the back, down the arms, and often stopping just above the wrist and neckline. This wasn't random. Tattoos had to remain hidden beneath daily clothing to avoid trouble with the authorities. Some Harishir signed their work, not visibly, but secretly, within the folds of a dragon's tail or hidden in the petals of a lotus. These subtle signatures became a badge of pride, recognizable only to those in the know. Despite the intimacy of the work, horishi lived with one foot outside of society. Their clientele were often firemen, gamblers, courtesans, people outside the elite. So the artists, too, lived on the edge, revered by the underground, invisible to the powerful. Irizumi wasn't just something you wore. It was something you survived. Every line, every shade, every drop of color came a price, measured in hours of motionless endurance and days of aching flesh. In Edo, Japan, the pain of tattooing wasn't a drawback, it was the entire point. Tebori, the traditional hand-poke method used by horishi, was brutal by design. The artist would dip the cluster of needles into sumi ink, then tap them rhythmically into the skin using a wooden stick or mallet. The process was slow, incredibly slow. A single outline could take hours. A full body tattoo might require years of regular sessions, each lasting half a day or more. There were no numbing creams, no mercy, only the sound of steady tapping and the raw sting of every puncture. But the pain was more than physical. It was symbolic. It separated the dilettantes from the devoted. It was a test of will, patience, and mental control. Clients didn't just receive tattoos, they earned them, and the endurance it took to sit through these sessions became a badge of honor, often discussed with quiet pride in bathhouses and taverns. Firefighters believed that the agony strengthened their courage. Gamblers viewed it as a test of luck and loyalty. Courtesans and lovers took on the pain as a symbol of their emotional depth for some. It was a punishment, for others, purification. There was a spiritual dimension to it as well. Enduring pain was seen as a kind of self-discipline, similar to fasting or meditation. Buddhist themes were common in Irezumi, not just because of their aesthetic value, but because they reflected ideas of suffering, rebirth, and enlightenment. With each completed session, a person didn't just come closer to finishing a tattoo, they came closer to transformation. And there were rules. You couldn't flinch. You couldn't cry out. Moving too much could ruin the design or earn you a scolding from the horoshi. Only the most serious clients completed their full bodysuit, known as Munawari, with a chest panel left blank to avoid shocking society if the robe fell open. In a world where the elite wore silk and status, the tattooed wore pain and permanence. Every inch of an Edo tattoo told a story. These weren't random designs picked from a menu. They were mythologies mapped onto the body. Carefully chosen symbols, each one with layered meanings, encoded in swirling ink that stretched from shoulder to ankle. For the tattooed in Edo, Japan, the body became a canvas of personal folklore. Take the koi fish, for example. It wasn't just decorative. A koi swimming upstream represented strength, determination, and the willingness to face impossible odds. According to legend, a koi that reached the top of the waterfall became a dragon. It was the perfect metaphor for a man trying to climb his way out of the lower classes to prove something the world refused to see. Dragons were everywhere, but they weren't the fire-breathing monsters of Western myth. They were protectors, spiritual guardians, powerful, wise, and deeply tied to the forces of nature. A dragon coiling across the back wasn't meant to intimidate. It was meant to shield a constant, unseen presence between your skin and the world. Peonies symbolized bravery with a touch of elegance. Tigers stood for ferocity and resolve. Waves meant life's unpredictability. Demons and ghosts warnings. Cautionary tales inked into the flesh as reminders of the dangers lurking in both the physical and spiritual world. Many tattoos depict full scenes from Chinese and Japanese folklore, battles, betrayals, and divine interventions. Popular subjects included the Suikoden, a Chinese epic about 108 outlaw heroes. These stories resonated with the tattooed class rebels, protectors, misfits who didn't quite fit into the samurai ideal, but still lived by a code. Buddhist deities were common too, particularly the wrathful ones. Figures like Fudo Mu, the immovable protector. With sword in one hand and rope in the other, he bound demons and cut through ignorance. Having him tattooed on your back was like carrying a spiritual bodyguard, one who didn't mind getting violent when necessary. But not all meanings were universal. A tattoo's placement, size, and direction all mattered. A tiger climbing upward might mean ambition. Downward could suggest a warning. Even the order of when each section was tattooed said something about your journey. These symbols were sacred, private, and powerful. And in a society where words could betray you, tattoos became the most honest form of expression as the Edo period progressed. The vibrant underground culture of Irezumi, once a secret code of honor among laborers, firemen, and gamblers, began to collide head-on with shifting social attitudes and rising paranoia from the ruling class. What was once admired in hidden bathhouses and tea houses slowly became associated with crime, deviance, and dishonor. The turning point came when the government began tightening its grip on public behavior, tattooing already unofficially frowned upon. It started to take on a more dangerous reputation, especially as it became more visible among the Bakudo or gamblers and other criminal groups who would eventually give rise to the modern Yakuza. These men were often the only ones bold enough to wear full body suits openly, and as they became more organized, so did the stigma attached to their ink. Ironically, many of these same criminals had begun as outcasts from society, men who wore tattoos not to provoke fear, but to reclaim identity. But once crime syndicates began using tattoos to mark membership, territory, and loyalty, public perception shifted. The police didn't care whether your dragon symbolized courage or your koi fish meant perseverance. To them, tattoos now signaled one thing: criminality. The government responded with more bans. In the early 1800s, tattooing was officially outlawed, though enforcement varied depending on the region and who was doing the inspecting. Still, tattoo parlors went deeper underground. Horoshi had to work in secret, clients booked sessions through coded language, and artists began developing techniques to hide tattoos under layers of ink, or blend them into larger designs to confuse officials. The stigma wasn't just legal, it was social. Anyone visibly tattooed could be refused entry into public bathhouses, barred from temples, or denied marriage by respectable families. Tattooed bodies became taboo, and the art form, once a mark of bravery or spiritual symbolism, was recast as something vulgar, dangerous, even evil. But the tattoos didn't disappear. They simply went deeper, both under the skin and under the radar for every government crackdown. There was a new design, a new hiding spot, a new client willing to endure pain for something meaningful. Irizumi didn't die. It went into hiding like a coiled dragon waiting. As Japan stepped into the modern age with the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the new government was eager to present the country as civilized, orderly, and most importantly, westernized. And in this new image of modern Japan, tattoos had no place. Irizumi, with all its cultural depth and underground prestige, was declared a stain. The government doubled down. Tattooing was not only criminal, it was now embarrassing. Something savage, something shameful. Foreign diplomats were horrified by the elaborate bodysuits worn by Edo's working class, and Japan, desperate to be taken seriously by the West, responded by pushing tattooing deeper underground than ever before. Yet even as it was banned for Japanese citizens, tattooing curiously became a tourist attraction. British and American sailors flocked to Japanese ports and sought out Harishur to take home pieces of exotic Oriental body art. Ironically, the very art form Japan sought to bury was being preserved by the very foreigners whose approval they craved. And still, the tradition didn't die. Harishur adapted. They changed their clientele, moved their studios further into secrecy, and kept the Tabori method alive. Master-apprentice lineages survived in whispers. The techniques, symbolism, and tools were passed down carefully, often within families or tightly knit artistic circles. In the 20th century, Irizumi became deeply entangled with the Yakuza. The full bodysuit, hidden beneath business suits, became a symbol of loyalty and fear within the criminal underworld once again. Tattoos were about pain, honor, and secrecy, but this time, without the folkloric grace of Edo firemen or mythological koi. The art was still there, but the public had turned away. Even today, the legacy of that stigma lingers. Despite modern interest in tattoo culture worldwide, Japan still views tattoos with suspicion. Public baths, gyms, and even some beaches ban tattooed individuals. The fear of criminal association endures, even when the ink is harmless. But times are shifting. Young Japanese artists are reclaiming Irizumi, not as rebellion, but as heritage. Museums are preserving ancient designs. Art lovers and historians are finally acknowledging the craftsmanship. And a new generation is asking why we should be ashamed of our own skin in a culture built on layers of robes, of meaning, of silence. Irizumi remains the most honest expression Japan ever tried to hide. In Renaissance Europe, discussing sex openly was taboo. Unless, of course, you were doing it through a thick Latin manuscript wrapped in religious guilt and printed under church supervision. Enter the marriage manual, a strange genre of literature where theologians, monks, and celibate scholars explained how good Christians were supposed to get busy. Solely for the purpose of procreation naturally, these manuals were less 50 shades and more 46 permissible positions for the glory of God. Titles like the Matrimonio or the Book of the Family disguise what they really were. Deeply detailed guides on when, how, and why married couples could engage in sexual activity, complete with diagrams, calendars, and lists of forbidden days. Spoiler: there were a lot of forbidden days. Sex on Sundays? Sinful. Feast days? Absolutely not. During Lent? God forbid. In fact, there were roughly 180 days a year when marital intimacy was prohibited. Combine that with the fear of damnation and the local priests snooping around, and it's a wonder Renaissance Europe ever managed to reproduce. These guides also gave advice on the proper mindset during intercourse. Joy was suspicious. Passion was risky. Love was fine, as long as it didn't make you too enthusiastic. Women were encouraged to be submissive and silent, and men were warned not to let their desire burn too brightly. Basically, the goal was spiritual union, with just enough physical action to make a baby and nothing else. But despite the dry language, these books were wildly popular, especially among clergy. Some manuals even had sections explaining which sexual positions were natural versus unnatural. The missionary was divine. Anything else was basically flirting with excommunication. Of course, educated Renaissance readers knew how to read between the lines. These books were some of the only texts that acknowledged sex at all, so people devoured them, not necessarily for pious reasons. A marriage manual on your shelf was totally acceptable. What you highlighted in it was your business. Ironically, the strict moral codes these books promoted only made people more curious about what lay beyond them. Which is why, right next to the marriage guides, another kind of book began to circulate, less holy, more illustrated. On the surface, they were scientific marvels, detailed anatomical treatises, often illustrated by respected artists and backed by university scholars. But for anyone with half an imagination and a locked drawer, these books had a certain extracurricular appeal, especially when the female form was involved. The Renaissance saw an explosion of interest in human anatomy, thanks to dissection being legalized in certain regions, and artists like Leonardo da Vinci pushing the boundaries of scientific observation. Texts like the Humani Corporis Fabrica by Andreas Vesalius were considered groundbreaking medical references. They were also, whether intentionally or not, kind of steamy. Why? Because they showed women naked in exquisite clinical full-body detail. Breasts, hips, genitalia. Nothing was omitted. And while the official purpose was to educate, let's just say not every reader was there for the lymphatic system. These images were often presented with artistic flair. One particularly infamous edition of an anatomical book showed a nude woman gracefully reclining as if in a Botticelli painting, except her chest cavity was flayed open like a diagram in a butcher's manual. It was both horrifying and oddly sensual. The body is art, the body is science, and for some, the body is entertainment. Since pornography was strictly banned by the church, these illustrations slipped through the moral net. Under the guise of medical necessity, a young man caught with a suggestive woodcut from a medical book could simply shrug and claim he was pursuing his studies. The fact that the page was dog-eared and mysteriously thumb-worn is irrelevant. Some printers even leaned into the dual appeal. Certain editions were produced with extra attention to the female form, featuring idealized nudes that blended anatomy with eroticism. A sort of Renaissance loophole. If you wanted to look at naked people, all you had to do was pretend to care about the spleen. And these weren't back-alley publications. They were printed by respected presses, collected in university libraries, and cited by physicians. But between the dry Latin and muscle diagrams, there was just enough soft-core temptation to keep readers flipping pages with slightly more enthusiasm than necessary. Of course, not all forbidden books were pretending to be scientific. Some didn't even bother to hide it. By the mid-Renaissance, a new kind of book began appearing in private collections, ones that didn't bother with anatomical dissection or theological loopholes. These were full-blown love manuals, half etiquette guide, half soft seduction playbook. They were written for the well-bred nobleman or lady who wanted to flirt without falling directly into hell. Unlike the dry, rule-bound marriage manuals sanctioned by the church, love manuals reveled in ambiguity. They walked a thin line, offering tips on courtship, letter writing, and romantic speech, all under the pretense of cultivating refined behavior. But between the lines, they dripped with innuendo. These books taught the art of the glance, the science of sighing in someone's direction, and the importance of hand placement during a slow court dance. They offered sample dialogues, thinly disguised pickup lines for situations like encountering a duchess in a garden or complimenting a lady's lute, playing without offending her chaperone. One popular genre was the epistolary romance, collections of fictional love letters between imaginary nobles, usually with names like Count Lorenzo and Lady Fiorella. These were meant to model virtuous behavior, but many letters veered suspiciously close to fantasy. You could practically hear the bodices tightening and the gloves slowly coming off. Some of these manuals even included miniature poems and riddles, just enough to feel cultured, just vague enough to be interpreted as scandalous. The Renaissance reader loved double meanings, and love manuals delivered them in elegant, rhyming couplets. And let's not forget the advice on grooming. One manual suggested men keep their fingernails clean and teeth white, so that a woman, when kissed, feels neither scratched nor offended. Others reminded ladies to maintain fresh breath and avoid onions before a romantic conversation. Practical, but not exactly spiritual. While these books didn't depict physical intimacy, they hinted at it constantly, and that was the point. They were less about lust and more about tension, the kind that built slowly across candle-lit ballrooms behind fans. Through veils for young nobles trapped between arranged marriages and strict religious codes, these manuals were escape hatches, legal to own, dangerous to understand. While the church cracked down on sin and scholars argued about virtue, some Renaissance readers were stashing ancient Roman poetry under their pillows, and not the kind Cicero would have approved of Ovid's Ars Amatoria, the art of love. It was one of the most widely circulated forbidden texts of the Renaissance. Technically a Roman classic, it offered a step-by-step guide to seduction, from spotting a lover at the theater to how to feign jealousy just enough to keep things spicy. It was witty, elegant, and totally immoral by church standards, naturally. It was extremely popular. Educated men and some very determined women kept copies of Ovid hidden behind Bibles or bound in blank covers to pass unnoticed. Marginalia in some surviving copies includes notes like "try this at Carnival" and "worked on Cecilia," because who said Latin had to be boring? Then there was The Golden Ass by Apuleius, a novel that slipped under the radar thanks to its mythological storyline, but included vivid scenes of transformation, lust, and the occasional talking donkey. It was technically a spiritual allegory. It was also erotica with a toga on. Even more daring were translations of Greek and Arabic love poetry, many of which emphasized sensual pleasure as a path to enlightenment. Renaissance Italy had a taste for the exotic and Arabic texts, like those inspired by the Perfume Garden, circulated in small elite circles. These weren't openly sold, but if you had the right connections and enough gold, a copy might find its way to your study. Booksellers knew how to play the game. Officially, their shops were stocked with theology and grammar. Unofficially, a wink and a discreet coin could earn you access to a locked cabinet, labeled medical curiosities or private readings. The church called it sinful. The merchants called it good business. Some nobles even commissioned illuminated manuscripts of these works, decorated with gold leaf cherubs and occasionally very detailed illustrations of things cherubs should not be watching. These books weren't just read, they were experienced, passed around at salons, whispered about at masquerades, banned by bishops, quoted by poets. And while everyone pretended they'd only read them for the Latin practice, the truth was obvious. For all the secret reading and scandalous giggling behind lace fans, the Renaissance wasn't a safe haven for literary freedom, especially not when the Inquisition was watching. And in Italy, it always was. By the mid-1500s, the Catholic Church had grown increasingly suspicious of books that could corrupt the soul, which in practice meant anything remotely entertaining in 1559. Pope Paul IV issued the first official Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. It was exactly what it sounded like. A hit list of texts deemed too dangerous, heretical, or, God forbid, titillating. The list included everything from Protestant theology to astrology manuals, but buried among them were treatises on love, anatomy, and even poetry. Ovid banned, Boccaccio's Decameron, ban. Anything by Erasmus that even hinted at individual thought. Double banned. The church wasn't just trying to save souls. It was sanitizing the entire intellectual bloodstream. Possessing a forbidden book didn't just mean a slap on the wrist. If you were a printer, merchant, or noble caught with one, you risked public penance, house searches, confiscation, and even imprisonment. More than one scholar found himself summoned to explain why he had a Latin copy of The Art of Love tucked between Aristotle and Aquinas. But the funny thing about banning books is that it usually makes them more desirable. Underground markets thrived. Printers in Venice, Lyon, and Basel published clean editions for public sale and uncut reader's editions for private clients. The difference might be a missing passage, a toned-down illustration, or a completely fake title page. One infamous copy of The Golden Ass was rebound as Sermons of St. Augustine. Talk about a plot twist. Noble families with private libraries developed entire systems for hiding forbidden texts. Secret compartments, false bindings, mirrored cabinets. It was part espionage, part erotica. A well-curated bookshelf said, "Yes, I fear God, but I also read Rabelais." Women were particularly clever about this. Since they were less likely to be targeted as intellectual threats, they often acted as literary couriers, borrowing, copying, and circulating books under the pretense of devotional reading. One nun in Naples allegedly kept a copy of The Perfumed Garden behind her copy of Lives of the Saints. Censorship may have ruled publicly, but in private, Renaissance readers just turned the page more carefully. Behind convent walls, away from the judgmental eyes of society and the ever-looming index of forbidden books, Renaissance nuns had access to their own libraries, and some of them were anything but holy. While convents were often seen as bastions of chastity and devotion, the truth was more complicated. These were also places of literacy, intellectual curiosity, and yes, suppressed desire. Many young women entered religious life not by choice, but by family arrangement. Too expensive to marry off, send her to the nuns. Too outspoken, cloister her. The result? A generation of women who were highly educated, forcibly celibate, and bored out of their minds enter the convent library. On the surface, these collections were pious and respectable. Saints' lives, theological commentaries, devotional poetry. But dig deeper and you'd find marginalia scrawled in the corners, entire passages underlined with suspicious enthusiasm, and in some cases, handwritten copies of banned love poetry tucked discreetly between prayer books. One nun in Ferrara was famously reprimanded for translating Ovid's Amores into the vernacular, allegedly for educational purposes. Others wrote their own verses, coded, melancholic, and often steeped in longing. Scholars today suspect that some of the most passionate Renaissance sonnets attributed to anonymous courtly ladies were actually penned by cloistered women using writing as a kind of romantic escape hatch. And it wasn't just poetry. Some convents had copies of anatomical treatises, ostensibly for medical knowledge, since nuns often acted as nurses. But as we've seen, anatomy books were rarely just about medicine. One abbess in Florence even petitioned to keep her convent's illustrated anatomy manual on the grounds that it helps the younger sisters understand temptation, which is a very creative interpretation. Of course, the church tried to regulate what was read behind those walls, but literacy meant autonomy, and autonomy meant subversion. Forbidden texts circulated quietly between trusted hands. Pages were memorized, copied, passed along with coded bookmarks. The scent of ink and vellum became more intoxicating than incense. In the silence of evening, after vespers and confession, a young nun might light a candle and open a worn book, not of scripture, but of something warmer. A poem, a story, a stolen fragment of a world she'd never touched but could still imagine. Because sometimes the most forbidden books weren't about lust. They were about freedom. Not all forbidden books were kept in libraries or chained to monastery shelves. Some were hidden in aprons, buried under floorboards, or whispered from memory in back alley markets. These weren't printed by respected presses or debated in salons. These were the other Renaissance texts, the magical ones. Handwritten grimoires, herb manuals, and charm books passed between midwives, herbalists, and women who were definitely not calling themselves witches, but everyone else was. Love was power. And power, especially when exercised by a woman, was dangerous. That's why love spells were among the most feared and popular forms of forbidden knowledge. Renaissance charm books often included instructions on how to win affection, cause obsession, or rekindle a cold marriage. A strand of hair, a cup of wine, a muttered phrase beneath the full moon. It wasn't theology. It was folk science. And it worked. Or at least it felt like it did. One famous spell book from southern Italy included a ritual for ensuring fidelity. Sow a pinch of dried basil into your lover's doublet, whisper their name 3 times, and sprinkle rose water on their pillow. If they dreamed of you that night, the magic could take and hold. If they didn't, well, there were stronger measures. Aphrodisiacs were another staple of these underground texts. Recipes blended Renaissance botany with medieval imagination. Cinnamon, anise, ground oysters, mandrake root, sometimes effective, sometimes toxic. One apothecary's manual cheerfully recommended a mixture of honey, wine, and powdered stag antler to awaken the fires of Venus. He failed to mention the violent nosebleeds. Men were curious, but women were the primary readers and keepers of these texts. Many passed recipes and rituals from mother to daughter, especially in rural areas where priests visited infrequently and midwives handled everything from birth to heartbreak. But owning such a book was a gamble. The Inquisition didn't look kindly on women with too much knowledge, and a love spell was just a witch trial waiting to happen. So pages were hidden, burned, or disguised as herbal journals. You could be an herbalist on Tuesday and a heretic by Thursday, depending on what someone saw or imagined. By the late Renaissance, the printing press had changed everything. Books were no longer handcrafted treasures for the elite, they were commodities. And while Gutenberg may have started with Bibles, it wasn't long before printers discovered a far more lucrative market desire. Venice became the capital of this quiet revolution. It had the perfect mix of wealth, lenient senses, and a healthy appetite for vice. Hidden behind religious tracts and scholarly commentaries, small, privately circulated books began to appear. Books that weren't coy about their contents. They didn't pretend to be anatomy manuals. They didn't disguise poetry as devotion. These were explicit, illustrated, and ready to shock. One of the most infamous of these was Imodi. Translated as the Positions, originally created by engraver Marcantonio Raimondi, with illustrations by Giulio Romano, it depicted 16 scenes of explicit intimacy. Each engraving was paired with poetic verses by Pietro Aretino, whose sharp wit and even sharper tongue earned him a reputation as the Renaissance's first pornographer. Needless to say, the church was not amused. Imodi was immediately banned. Plates were seized, copies destroyed. Raimondi was arrested. But the damage, or depending on your perspective, innovation was done. The idea that you could use the printing press for erotica had been unleashed, and it wasn't going back in the bottle. Underground presses sprang up across Europe, printing slim volumes of love poetry, scandalous tales, and sometimes outright smut. These weren't mass-produced. Copies were expensive, meant for wealthy patrons with a taste for the forbidden. Some were even commissioned privately, with content tailored to the buyer's fantasy. Think of it as custom Renaissance fan fiction. Printers developed clever tricks to avoid detection. Fake title pages, false publishing locations printed in Constantinople, or Latin phrases that made the books look like harmless philosophy in reality. They were often illustrated with woodcuts or copper engravings that made anatomy textbooks look tame. For the right price, you could have a book that thrilled, amused, or shocked without ever admitting you owned it. Many nobles kept theirs in cabinets with special keys. Some had bindings that, when shelved, looked like dictionaries or psalters. The printing press didn't just democratize knowledge, it made lust portable. And with every new title, Renaissance readers got one step closer to something revolutionary without permission. By the end of the Renaissance, the line between education, entertainment, and seduction had blurred beyond recognition. What began as anatomical curiosity or theological instruction had transformed into a secret bookshelf of longing, one that crossed gender, class, and even religious boundaries. And that's precisely what made it so dangerous. To the church, these books represented moral decay. To scholars, they were intellectual experiments. But to the people actually reading them, noblewomen, students, nuns, even merchants, they were something else entirely. Power. Not the kind won on a battlefield or in a courtroom, but the quieter, more subversive kind that starts in the margins of a book in an age where women's bodies were controlled, their voices silenced, and their desires shamed. These books offered an alternative script, a place where love wasn't always arranged, where pleasure could be named, and where curiosity didn't have to be confessed in Latin. Whether it was a love spell hidden in a herb manual, a censored sonnet copied by hand, or a banned poem read by candlelight, each was a rebellion in disguise. And let's not forget the men for all the public bravado and church-sponsored guilt. They were buying these books too. Philosophers who debated virtue by day might go home and read The Golden Ass with a glass of wine. Priests who condemned lust from the pulpit sometimes kept a copy of Ovid tucked beneath their cassocks. Human nature, after all, has always been good at compartmentalizing. The Forbidden Bookshelf wasn't just a Renaissance quirk. It was a reflection of a world wrestling with change. The printing press had opened Pandora's box. Literacy was spreading. Ideas were getting harder to control. And once people realized that books could make them feel something deeply, privately, even sinfully, there was no going back. Most of these books didn't survive intact. They were burned, hidden, miscatalogued. But some did. They sit today in museum vaults and rare book rooms, fragile and foxed with age, still humming with the echoes of secrets whispered across centuries. Because the Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth of art and science, it was a rebirth of desire. And in between the sermons and sculptures, the forbidden books tell us everything the marble could. It's not so much that the innkeeper wakes up, it's that he is awakened by the gentle sound of someone sneezing directly onto the floorboards below his room, followed by a groan, a crash, and the unmistakable clatter of a chicken escaping through the front door. Again, he opens one eye. It's still dark out, which means it's either too early or too late. There's no in-between in medieval timekeeping. He sits up slowly, as if peeling himself off a loaf of bread, and rubs the sleep from his face with a sleeve that once resembled linen, but now has the texture of a worn saddlebag. His bed isn't bad, just simple. A straw mattress, slightly slanted with a blanket that smells faintly of garlic and last Tuesday's ale. Cozy in the way a slightly damp cloak is cozy if you don't ask too many questions. He dresses in stages, first the tunic, then the trousers, then the belt, if he can find it. After a brief search, he locates it hanging on a peg behind the door, along with a spoon, a candle nub, and someone's sock. He doesn't ask whose. Asking questions before sunrise is a mistake. Downstairs, the common room is quiet, unnervingly so. There are signs of life. A tipped mug, a boot near the hearth, a man snoring under a table with the confidence of someone who's done this before. The innkeeper steps carefully around him. Waking guests too early often leads to awkward, sword-point discussions. He stokes the hearth with a practiced flick of the poker. The goal is warmth, not a roaring blaze. Firewood is expensive, and the last time he got a real blaze going, someone tried to cook a goose on it indoors with feathers still on. As he sets a pot over the flames, ready to reheat whatever last night's stew has evolved into, he hears the distant bray of a mule and the clump of early travelers arriving. He exhales. The inn isn't glamorous, but it's warm, it's busy, and most importantly, it's his. And just like that, the day begins again. Breakfast at the inn is less of a meal and more of a negotiation between what's edible and what's legally defensible. The innkeeper ladles a thick scoop of something into a pot over the hearth. It doesn't have a name, but it does have a smell, somewhere between boiled oats and a wet boot that's been thinking about cabbage. This is pottage, a medieval staple, not a recipe so much as a concept. Yesterday's pottage was made with barley and turnips. Today's includes those same turnips, now softer, and some mysterious bits from a goose that failed to escape last night. Add water, heat, repeat. It's like soup if soup gives up halfway. The bread is present, hard as a roof tile, and just as chewable. It's cut with care, mostly because the innkeeper doesn't want to break another knife on it. Guests chew it slowly, partly for digestion, partly because there's time to reflect on their life choices between bites. And the ale? Oh yes, breakfast beer. It's not a medieval cliche. It's a necessity. The water here is questionable. The milk is reserved for the Lord's barn cat, and tea is still a twinkle in some far-off merchant's eye. The ale is weak, but at least it's been boiled and filtered through sheer desperation. Even the children drink it with supervision, of course. This is a reputable establishment, after all. By now, guests are drifting in one by one. A merchant with a coin purse clutched like a holy relic, a sleepy pilgrim still clutching his walking stick and muttering about blisters, and inevitably the bard who requests honey for his porridge. As though honey hasn't been locked in a chest for weeks, the barmaid, agile and immune to nonsense, moves between tables like a dancer who's had enough. She smiles at the patrons, refills mugs, and dodges unsolicited compliments with the grace of someone who has memorized every possible bad poem a drunk traveler can recite. By the end of breakfast, the inn smells like smoke, barley, and ambition. Empty bowls clatter onto tables. Stomachs are foolish, spirits are lukewarm. It's not fine dining, but it's hot, it's filling, and nobody's died yet, which, by medieval standards, is a triumph. If there's one thing a medieval inn doesn't need more of, it's people. Yet by mid-morning they begin to pour in like pigeons with luggage, and about the same regard for personal hygiene. First through the door is a knight, or rather someone claiming to be a knight. He has armor, yes, but it's mismatched, rusty, and held together with what looks like curtain rope. He demands a private room, despite having no coin, no manners, and the general scent of a horse that lost a bet. Behind him is a merchant's apprentice who talks like he owns a fleet of ships but pays with buttons. He tries to haggle over a bowl of soup, as though this establishment offers Groupon deals. Then comes the bard. Every inn has one. He never actually pays, but insists that his songs are worth more than gold. They aren't. He carries a lute, 6 strings missing, and immediately launches into a mournful tune about lost love and goat theft. Nobody asked for this. A monk shuffles in next, nodding solemnly at everyone and blessing the furniture. He insists on fasting loudly while eyeing the bread. Within 10 minutes, he's eating said bread, and explaining that technically, it's not a sin if the loaf was already broken. By noon, the inn is full of clashing personalities and overlapping smells. Someone is drying their socks near the hearth. Someone else is sharpening a knife for no clear reason. A child runs between tables, pursued by a goose with a grudge. In the corner, 2 travelers argue over who gets the only stool without a wobble, and overseeing it all is the innkeeper. Calm as a monk on payday, he's seen it all before. He knows that by evening someone will fall in love, someone will fall asleep in their soup, and someone will challenge a stool to a duel. Probably the bard again. He pours another mug, wipes the counter with a cloth that has seen better centuries, and gives a nod to the barmaid. A silent agreement that, despite everything, this place is still running. The guests may be unpredictable loud, occasionally bleeding, but they're also what makes the inn an inn, and he wouldn't have it any other way, except quieter and with fewer goose chases. If the inn has a soul, or at least a functioning brain, it's the barmaid. Her name is Marjorie. She's about 20, possibly 30. Or maybe she just aged rapidly from exposure to traveling poets. No one knows for sure. What people do know is that the entire operation would collapse into a stew-soaked heap without her. She moves through the chaos with practiced precision, one hand balancing a tray of mugs, the other swatting a wandering hand that misjudged her patience. Her reflexes are faster than a ferret in a pantry. A drunken mercenary once tried to compliment her ankles and woke up 2 days later with his boots nailed to the ceiling. Marjorie can take an order in 4 dialects, pour ale without spilling a drop, and insult a noble without technically committing treason. She's not rude, she's efficient, and in a building held together by splinters and half-promises, she's the only one with actual authority. She knows which travelers will pay in coin and which will try to barter with seashells. She can sniff out a fake accent, a stolen ring, and a flirt disguised as a food complaint. The monk may mumble about sin, but even he knows. Marjorie is the patroness of keeping things moving. Her day starts before dawn and ends long after the fire burns low. In that time she'll serve stew, chase children, bandage a scraped knee, and somehow find time to refill every mug in the room, often while dodging falling cutlery or calming down an argument about who owns the goat that wandered in during lunch. And yet, she never drops the tray. That's the magic of it. Marjorie doesn't run the inn on paper, but in practice, it's her kingdom. The innkeeper might own the walls, but she controls the floor. A wink here, a sharp word there, a stare that can curdle milk. It's a delicate dance, and she performs it daily with a kind of grace that only comes from years of low expectations and high tolerance. Lunch at a medieval inn isn't so much a meal, as it is a test of coordination, patience, and one's tolerance for noise that registers somewhere between festival and siege. It begins innocently enough. The hearth is warm, the stew is bubbling, and Marjorie rings the battered iron triangle that signals food is ready. A peaceful moment, brief, immediately followed by stampede-level chaos. Guests emerge from corners you didn't know existed. A trader leaps over a sleeping dog. A bard swings his lute over one shoulder, like he's marching into battle. Two farmers argue over who sat down first, despite there being 6 empty benches and absolutely no one keeping score. The innkeeper ladles out steaming bowls of pottage, a dish whose exact ingredients are known only to the pot and possibly divine beings. It's hearty, warm, and completely flavorless, unless you count turnip as a flavor. One guest asks if it's vegetarian. Another asks what vegetarian means. The innkeeper pretends he doesn't hear either of them. Bread is handed out with the ceremonial thunk of something recently used as a doorstop. Diners attempt to dip it in their stew to soften it, resulting in several casualties to the bottoms of bowls. One man tries to trade his crust for a second helping of ale. It works. Marjorie weaves through the chaos, her tray loaded with mugs, and her eyes locked in that 1,000-yard stare known only to battlefield nurses and women who've had to break up 2 arguments about seating etiquette before noon. She doles out food, smiles, and issues warnings all at once. A one-woman performance that deserves a round of applause but will settle for a full tip jar. Somewhere near the hearth, a pair of guards is trying to out-burp each other while a suspiciously cheerful monk hums a hymn between mouthfuls. The goat has returned. Again, it seems to enjoy the company. Lunch lasts about an hour, at least according to the sun. Time inside the inn is measured by how long it takes for someone to spill ale on themselves, accuse someone else of cheating at dice, or attempt to sing with a mouthful of onion. And when it's over, there's silence, brief, eerie, until someone drops a spoon and it all begins again. Lunch is over. The stew has been consumed. The bread has been gnawed. The goat has once again been escorted out with stern words and a broom. Now begins the part of the day innkeepers dread most, cleaning up after the guests who swore they were very tidy. To the untrained eye, it may look like a normal dining room in mild disarray, but to Marjorie and the innkeeper, it's a full-blown archaeological dig site, complete with mysterious stains, lost personal items, and a deeply unsettling amount of onion peels in places onions should never have been. The wooden tables are wiped down with a cloth that, much like the innkeeper, has seen too much. It doesn't clean so much as smear everything into a nice medieval glaze. The floors are swept, mostly by pushing things under benches and hoping gravity takes care of the rest. A boot is discovered under one of the stools. No one claims it. It's added to the growing pile behind the bar, labeled possibly belonging to someone. Marjorie starts collecting dishes with the speed and precision of someone who's done this every day for a decade and would very much like to stop. Guests who linger too long get the look. A glance so potent it once made a noble apologize and tip an entire silver coin. He was never seen again, but the story remains legend. The stew pot is scraped clean. Whatever remains is either fed to the pigs or quietly reincorporated into tomorrow's recipe. Waste not, want not, especially when nobody can tell the difference after the 3rd bowl. The innkeeper mutters something about washing the mugs, but everyone knows he'll just rinse them in the rain barrel and call it divine purification. There is a bucket for soaking, but it's mostly ceremonial at this point, as the final crumbs are brushed away and the benches are set back in place. Somehow always wobblier than before, the room starts to resemble an inn again, rather than the scene of a particularly well-fed riot. Marjorie takes a breath, straightens her apron, and prepares for the next wave. Because in a medieval inn, peace is never permanent. It's just the brief pause between one mess and the next, and somewhere someone is already asking when supper will be ready. Just as the last bowl is stacked, the last spoon is dried. Ish and Marjorie dares to take a sip of leftover ale in peace. It happens. The door creaks open. New guests, fresh faces, fresh problems, and worst of all, questions. The first traveler steps in wearing an oversized cloak, a beard that could house several woodland creatures, and an expression that suggests he's about to review the place on parchment. He walks up to the bar and asks, "Do you serve almond milk?" The silence is immediate and total. Somewhere in the corner, the stool creaks under the weight of collective judgment. Behind him arrives a young couple, clearly not married, based on how closely they're standing and how determined they are not to touch, who ask if they can see the room first. Marjorie simply points upstairs. It's wooden. It has walls. It doesn't leak in summer. Usually a third guest, covered in dust and self-importance, insists on knowing where the inn sources its candles, whether the stew is ethically prepared, and if the goat has been trained to stay outside. The goat, of course, enters at that exact moment and promptly sneezes on his boots. Then there's the bard, a different bard this time, who insists on paying with a song. He plucks his lute, hits 3 wrong notes in a row, and launches into a ballad about the lady and the leaky chamber pot. He is immediately asked to stop politely with a broom. The innkeeper nods his way through every request, every complaint, and every mispronounced question about wine varieties. There's one wine, and it's reddish. He doesn't argue. He doesn't correct. He simply listens, smiles, and lets Marjorie handle it. Because if there's one thing that fills an inn faster than rain, it's travelers with opinions, and they never arrive quietly. By sundown, the common room is a patchwork of personalities. The quiet scribe in the corner, the arguing merchants near the fire, the bard on his second attempt at winning affection through volume, and the goat now asleep under table 3. The innkeeper exhales another batch of guests, another round of small disasters waiting to unfold, and all of them somehow think they're the normal ones. Supper time arrives not with elegance, but with noise. Loud, overlapping noise. Chairs scrape, mugs clink. Someone coughs theatrically to hint that they've been waiting ages, even though they arrived 9 minutes ago and are still wearing their traveling cloak like it's a crown. Marjorie emerges from the kitchen, holding a pot that's technically still warm and definitely still stew. The day's menu hasn't changed. It's still the inn's signature dish, whatever was left from earlier. Slightly reheated, it's served with a chunk of bread that could double as a blunt weapon and a side of commentary from the guests. This stew tastes different than last night, one traveler says with suspicion. It's the same stew, Marjorie replies without looking up. Oh well, it's nice, they add quickly, now fearing for their cutlery privileges. The bard, who is still here somehow, offers to perform a song in honor of the meal. He gets through one verse before Marjorie places a ladle in his bowl with a little more enthusiasm than necessary. He gets the message over near the hearth. 2 merchants are having a lively debate about grain prices, which is somehow louder than a couple arguing about how many fleas they counted on the bed upstairs. The goat has returned. It is now under the table again, being quietly fed by a child who insists it's his emotional livestock. The stew is filling. The ale flows freely, which helps with how filling the stew is, and despite the occasional complaint about texture, temperature, or the existential ambiguity of the meat, everyone eats. The innkeeper stands behind the counter, polishing a mug that hasn't been truly cleaned since the last harvest, watching his patrons with the expression of a man who has accepted his fate. He knows that in about an hour someone will spill something. Someone else will fall asleep mid-sentence, and the bard will try again. He always tries again. But for now the room is loud, messy, and very much alive, which is, if nothing else, a sign of success. Because in a medieval inn, supper doesn't need to be good. It just needs to arrive without catching fire as the last spoon clinks against the bottom of a bowl. And guests begin to lean back with the satisfied groans of people who survived another round of stew. The real show begins. Evening entertainment, loosely defined. There is no scheduled program, no flyers, no host with a lute and a schedule. The evening simply unfolds the way all great performances do, with no structure, limited talent, and a strong chance of mild injury. The bard, of course, seizes the moment. He clears his throat dramatically, plucks three uncertain strings, and announces a ballad titled The Fair Lady of Festerwell Who Married a Troll. Half the room cheers, the other half groans. The goat sneezes. His voice is enthusiastic. The lyrics rhyme occasionally. The innkeeper pours himself a mug of ale and drinks deeply, the way a man does when he knows there are still 6 verses to go. And at least one of them will involve sock theft. Meanwhile, at the far table, 2 old friends are trying to best each other in a slurred riddle contest. The rules are unclear. One of the riddles might actually be a recipe. A nearby monk politely covers his ears and starts humming psalms at a volume typically reserved for church bells. The dice come out next, wooden, chipped, and possibly blessed or cursed. Opinions vary. A small crowd gathers as bets are made using coins, buttons, a very old pair, and one man's left shoe. Nobody questions it. The pair's value is disputed. Marjorie circles the room like a falcon with excellent hearing. She's watching for trouble, Spilldale, and anyone who looks like they're about to stand on a table. She catches the bard mid-step, just as he tries to perform a dramatic gesture on a bench leg that clearly wasn't designed for theater. In the corner, a shy traveler shyly produces a flute. It produces 3 lovely notes before the goat heads him. Applause all around. Evening entertainment at the inn isn't polished, rehearsed, or even entirely legal in some towns. But it's real, it's loud, and it almost always ends with someone snoring into their mug, waking up with a new tattoo drawn in soot. There is no official closing time at the inn. There's no bell, no lights out announcement, and certainly no polite usher guiding guests toward the door. No closing time is more of a gradual societal collapse. It begins when the bard finally loses his audience. This usually happens when he forgets the lyrics to the final verse and replaces them with dramatic throat noises. Someone throws a crust of bread in appreciation. It's unclear whether it's applause or a bribe to stop. Next, a few patrons start to slump, not from ale necessarily, but from sheer caloric weight. The stew is settled. Gravity has won. One merchant leans so far back on his stool that he becomes furniture. His companion uses him as a footrest. Marjorie starts stacking empty mugs like she's building a small fortress. She doesn't say much, just raises one eyebrow, which in the language of innkeeping means wrap it up or start sweeping. There's always one guest who insists on ordering something after the hearth has gone dark. Tonight it's a peddler who thinks a light snack means a full roast duck. He is given bread, a look and a firm suggestion to chew slowly and sleep sooner. The goat, ever present, has curled up by the embers. It is technically not allowed indoors, but at this point, it's paid more attention during story hour than half the human, so exceptions are made. The innkeeper begins his rounds. He pokes at the dying fire, checks that no one has passed out face down in the stew pot again, and gently nudges a snoring traveler off a table and onto a bench. A professional move learned through years of subtle repositioning. One couple heads upstairs, bumping into every visible surface. They will, by morning, complain about the noise. The irony is noted and filed away for later passive-aggressive amusement. Eventually, the room empties. Not all at once, but in soft, wobbly waves, like a tide of cloaks, yawns, and the occasional hiccup. The chatter fades. The laughter dies down, then grows quiet. Sort of. A mug rolls off a table. Someone upstairs drops a boot. The goat sighs deeply. But for now, the worst of the day is over. The guests are asleep, or at least horizontal, and no longer speaking. Climbing the stairs in a medieval inn is an act of faith, not spiritual faith, structural. The steps creak, groan, and occasionally shift underfoot like they're considering early retirement. But for the weary traveler, upstairs means one thing: a place to collapse. The rooms vary. Some are private if you're wealthy or convincingly loud about it. Most, however, are shared dormitory-style arrangements where strangers sleep mere inches apart and everyone pretends not to hear anything. The beds are wooden frames stuffed with straw and dreams. Blankets, if you're lucky. Pillows only if you brought your own or creatively folded your cloak. And yes, the straw rustles constantly. Sometimes because it's dry, sometimes because something inside it is also trying to sleep. Snoring is inevitable. Someone always starts within moments of lying down. Not light, adorable snoring. We're talking medieval snoring, the kind that echoes off wooden beams and makes you question if there's a wild boar in the rafters. One guest tosses in his sleep, another talks. One hums a hymn through his nose, which is deeply unsettling. Privacy as a concept does not exist. You can pull your cloak over your head, but that only muffles the sounds of someone in the next bed loudly discussing dreams involving fish and taxes. Someone else keeps getting up to check on the stew, which is just code for needing the chamber pot located discreetly behind a curtain that fools no one. Speaking of which, yes, the chamber pot. It's there. It's full. It's everyone's problem. It's also someone's footrest until they realize their mistake too late. Occasionally, someone stumbles in after dark, unsure of which bed is theirs, and prepared to argue about it. Arguments are brief, muffled by exhaustion, and typically settled by whoever has the larger boots or stronger odor. And yet, despite the noises, the smells, the suspicious straw, and the shared air, there's something oddly comforting about it. A dozen people, all from different places, sleeping under the same crooked beams, snoring in harmony. Upstairs isn't peaceful, but it's safe, warmish, and with luck, mostly free of goats, which at this hour of night counts as luxury. It's late. The fire has burned down to glowing embers. The common room is finally still, except for the occasional creak, the kind that makes you wonder if the building is settling, or if something alive is navigating the beams. Either way, it's time for the innkeeper's midnight patrol. This ritual isn't written anywhere, but every innkeeper knows it. It involves a candle stub, an exhausted sigh, and a silent prayer that no one has died, started a fire, or sleepwalked into the pantry again. The tour begins downstairs. The benches are mostly empty. The mugs are half drunk, half spilled, and possibly fermenting into something new. A spoon floats in the ale barrel. The innkeeper doesn't want to know how or why. He checks the doors, front and back, both bolted. Probably. Maybe. The front one tends to swing open during high winds or emotional conversations. He props a bucket in front of it just in case. Behind the counter, he counts the coins from the day's trade. Most of it is real currency. Some of it is buttons, carved bones, and once again, that same old pair. He places it in the undecided value ball. Next stop, upstairs. He tiptoes like a man, sneaking through a nest of mildly drunk wolves. Each floorboard betrays him with a creak louder than the last. Behind one door, someone snores with conviction. Behind another, someone mumbles about taxes in their sleep. He peeks into the shared room, a sea of limbs and cloaks. One guest is sleeping upside down. Another has tucked themselves under the bed. Like a human storage box, the chamber pod is full as always. Then comes the weird part of the patrol. Things that shouldn't be moving. The room has fallen over again. The candle flickers despite no draft. He hears the unmistakable sound of a lute string being plucked, even though the bard went to bed 2 hours ago or was tied to the wagon outside. Depends who you ask. And of course, the goat is missing again. The innkeeper exhales. Everything is, by this in standards, fine. He descends the stairs, blows out the candle, and mutters, "If anything catches fire, let it be the bad stew." It's the middle of the night, and technically everyone is asleep. But let's not pretend it's restful. The shared upstairs room hums like a beehive of human discomfort. Snoring is the dominant sound, layered, textured, and deeply unmusical. One guest snores in short bursts like a hiccuping squirrel. Another goes for volume, vibrating the rafters with every exhale. It's like a symphony of sleep apnea. Someone talks in their sleep, mostly about carrots. Another keeps whispering, "No, my lord," in a tone that suggests either a bad dream or a romantic misunderstanding. A boot falls with a thud onto the floor. Nobody moves, not even the goat now snuggled beneath someone's cloak like it owns the place. The bed frames creak in protest every time someone rolls over, which happens often, as straw mattresses are not known for their ergonomic support. In fact, if you're not stabbed by a twig in the first 5 minutes, the bed is probably haunted. Then there's the heat. With so many bodies in one room, temperature climbs to barn in summer. Cloaks are shared, blankets kicked, and someone decides to open the shuttered window, immediately letting in a breeze and the local owl, who now refuses to leave. The smell. It's what one might politely call robust. A fragrant blend of stew digestion, unwashed socks, warm goat, and the vague ghost of ale. It would be unbearable if everyone weren't already too tired to care. Occasionally, someone wakes up convinced it's morning. It's not. It's just darker than before, and now there's an owl watching. They stumble out of bed, step on someone's hand, and are shoo-shed back into place with a grunt. Marjorie sleeps in the back room, ear-trained to pick up anything alarming. Raised voices, sudden crashes, or lute music after hours. So far so good. Mostly. And downstairs, the innkeeper snoozes behind the bar in a chair shaped exactly like his spine. He holds a mug he didn't finish. He dreams of silence. He will not get it. Because in a medieval inn, sleep comes in short shifts, shared spaces, and suspicious warmth. But still, everyone's horizontal. That's considered victory at the first hint of light, that faint, murky gray that could be dawn, or just an optimistic moon. The inn begins to stir. Not gracefully, more like a barn full of animals that have realized someone forgot to lock the door. Feet hit the floor with varying degrees of commitment. Someone groans dramatically, as if waking up was unexpected and entirely unfair. Another guest immediately begins searching for their missing boot. It's on the hearth. No one knows how. The goat does, but he's not telling. The shared room empties in waves. The early risers, merchants, monks, and anyone with a guilty conscience creep out first. They leave behind a mess of wrinkled blankets, muddy footprints, and one still sleeping traveler who insists, even in dreams, that he didn't touch the cheese. Downstairs, the innkeeper is already awake. Technically, his eyes are open. His body is upright, but his soul is still halfway between this world and wherever old barkeeps go in their dreams, somewhere with clean mugs and quiet guests. Marjorie arrives moments later, wrapped in a shawl and sheer determination. She begins her silent inventory of overnight damage. 2 overturned stools, 1 missing candle, and someone inexplicably put jam on the broom handle. Questions start immediately. Has anyone seen my satchel? Did I pay last night? Is this my goat? To each, Marjorie offers the same response. A slow blink, followed by a flag. Maybe. Then comes the denials. I didn't spill that ale. I wasn't the one snoring. I never said that about the monk's sandals. Everyone denies everything loudly, even when confronted with direct evidence, like a ladle stuck in someone's belt, or a half-eaten turnip in their boot. The bard reappears, bleary-eyed and declaring he has written a new verse about the night's events. He is promptly offered a bowl of porridge, told to eat quietly. For once, he complies. Breakfast is served, stew is reheated, ale is poured. Life continues. By the time the sun fully rises, most guests have either paid or bartered their way out. Some leave sheepishly. Others stride off proudly, convinced they were charming. But one truth remains. Nobody ever admits what happened after supper. The guests have trickled out. The goat has been escorted again, and Marjorie is scraping something unidentifiable off a bench with the focus of a surgeon and the face of a woman reconsidering every life choice that led her here. The common room is quiet now, not peaceful, just taking a breath. A few embers crackle in the hearth. The floor is sticky. One bench lists slightly to the left, either from misuse or protest. The innkeeper stands behind the counter, cradling a mug of the morning's first ale, like it's a family heirloom. He gazes across the room and mutters the same thing he mutters every morning. Well, that wasn't too bad. It was, of course, but optimism helps digestion. Marjorie walks past with a tray of used spoons, a frayed cloth, and the look of someone who will not be answering questions before sunrise tomorrow. She refills the stew pot with water, salt, and faith, and begins stirring. Breakfast will happen, as always. Outside, a cart rattles by. A rooster announces its existence. Somewhere in the village, a smith hammers something unreasonably loud for this hour, and just like that, the world is awake again. And with the world come new guests. The inn's door opens. A farmer steps in, dragging a sack of something possibly vegetable. Behind him, a woman with a travel cloak and the polite smile of someone about to complain about prices. And naturally, a knight with a dented helmet and no indoor voice. They look around. Nods are exchanged. Coins change hands. Questions are asked. Answers are vague. The cycle begins again. The innkeeper takes a sip. Marjorie reties her apron. A chair is right. A mug is filled. A stranger sits down and immediately asks if there's a vegan option. Then doesn't change much. The stew stays mysterious. The guests remain unpredictable. The goat, one suspect, has a spare key. And yet, despite the noise, the mess, and the deeply suspicious smells, they always come back. Maybe it's the warmth, the company, the chaos. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the only place in town where your mistakes get swept up with the crumbs and nobody asks questions before breakfast. In the early 1600s, the Dutch Republic was about the size of a pancake and just as flat. But don't let geography fool you. This modest patch of reclaimed swamp was about to punch far above its weight. While the rest of Europe was busy stabbing each other over religion, and whose king had the shinier boots, the Dutch quietly built an empire of light, money, and oil paint. It started with a revolution. Spain had been bossing the Netherlands around for decades, waving the Catholic flag and squeezing taxes out of every fish and tulip bulb. But by 1648, after nearly 80 years of kicking and screaming, the Dutch finally declared we're done. And just like that, they were free. What followed was less of a national plan and more of an entrepreneurial free-for-all. Imagine Silicon Valley, but everyone wears wooden shoes and invests in herring. Amsterdam became the Wall Street of Europe. Its ports were crowded with ships headed to Asia, Africa, the Americas. Anywhere with goods to trade or people to exploit, the Dutch East India Company, basically the Amazon Prime of the 17th century, made fortunes off nutmeg, porcelain, and let's not forget colonization. But the real twist? While their ships were hauling cinnamon across oceans, back home people were reading newspapers, sipping beer, and watching their neighbors get immortalized in oil by guys named Rembrandt and Vermeer. These painters didn't just make portraits. They made legends. Vermeer captured quiet, intimate moments, lit like divine cinema. Rembrandt gave old men and biblical figures more drama than a reality show. Art wasn't just for kings anymore. Merchants wanted portraits too. Even butchers could afford a nice still life with a pig's head and a lemon. Tasteful. And then there were the tulips. Oh yes, the infamous tulip mania. A brief but spectacular episode where people sold entire houses just to own a flower bulb. One bulb. The market crashed harder than a drunk sailor, but by then the Dutch had already established their reputation. Wildly successful, slightly unhinged, and never boring. So how did a tiny, damp republic become the envy of Europe? By mastering the sea, the stock market, and the self-portrait. And this was just the beginning. If the Dutch Golden Age had a beating heart, it wasn't in a palace or a parliament. It was in the docks. Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Hoorn, Delft. These weren't just cities. They were launch pads for global domination with sails and spreadsheets. While France was polishing its wigs and Spain was still counting its gold, the Dutch were busy inventing capitalism, one logbook at a time. Their secret weapon, the merchant fleet. At its peak, the Dutch had more ships than any other nation on Earth, more than England, more than Spain, possibly more than common sense should allow. But these weren't just fishing boats with attitude. These were armed merchant ships, sleek and practical, loaded with cannon and cargo space. They carried everything. Silk from China, spices from Indonesia, sugar from Brazil, and occasionally a cannonball to the face if pirates showed up. The Dutch East India Company, also known by its terrifying acronym VOC, was the world's first multinational corporation. Shareholders, stock markets, dividends. Yes, it was capitalism before it was cool or even ethical. The VOC did whatever it took to protect profit. Fortresses, private armies, and let's not sugarcoat it, some rather ruthless colonial tactics. The spice trade wasn't just cutthroat, it was decapitation friendly. And while the VOC was ruling the East, the West India Company was handling things in the Atlantic. Think sugar, rum, and slavery. The Dutch involvement in the transatlantic slave trade was not just incidental. It was systemic, calculated, and profitable. The same country commissioning paintings of milkmaids was also trading human lives on a ledger. The Golden Age had a deeply tarnished underside. Yet amid this brutal efficiency, the Dutch also brought a kind of order to global trade. Their ships sailed on set routes, their cargoes were cataloged, their ports were clean, secure, and shockingly well insured. If there was ever a nation that could ship tulips, cheese, and gunpowder in the same boat without confusing the labels, it was the Dutch. They weren't just navigating oceans, they were navigating economics. While other countries sent explorers, the Dutch sent accountants with muskets. Their empire wasn't just built with swords, it was built with balance sheets. And somehow, amid the maritime hustle, their little republic kept thriving. Next, we zoom into the velvet-lit world of Vermeer, where everyday life became eternal. While Dutch ships hauled goods across continents and trading companies turned quarterly profits into golden chandeliers, something else was happening quietly, almost silently, in the towns and homes of the Dutch Republic. A girl poured milk, a woman laced her pearls. A letter was read in silence beside an open window. And with every mundane moment, a man named Johannes Vermeer turned ordinary life into eternal poetry. Vermeer wasn't the most famous painter of his day. In fact, he wasn't even the busiest. He produced a grand total of about 35 known works. That's less than what Rembrandt spilled on the floor during a single bad week. But what Vermeer lacked in volume, he made up for in radiance. His paintings are calm, composed, and eerily luminous, like someone painted sunlight holding its breath. What set him apart? Precision, detail, and a near mystical understanding of life. The interiors he painted weren't just backgrounds, they were characters. You could almost hear the creak of the wooden floors and the ticking of a clock. And that's the secret of the Dutch Golden Age, while the outside world raced forward. Artists like Vermeer captured the sacredness of slowness. Of course, Vermeer's magic wasn't performed in a vacuum. This was a society that adored images. The average Dutch home in the 17th century had more paintings on the walls than forks in the kitchen drawer. Landscapes, portraits, still lives, ships, cows, and a generous number of dead fish arranged on tables. They loved it all. Why? Because this was a middle-class country. Merchants, bakers, and brewers had money and taste. They didn't want cherubs floating in clouds. They wanted something that looked like their world, but slightly better lit. And the painters delivered. Dutch art became an industry, fast, detailed, and refreshingly local. But back to Vermeer. His works weren't flashy or political. They didn't shout. They whispered. And in those whispers were volumes about intimacy, solitude, and the quiet drama of domestic life. He painted what was often overlooked and made it unforgettable. In the next chapter, we'll step out of these golden lit rooms and into the streets of a booming republic. Because outside Vermeer's windows, an economic experiment was brewing that would both dazzle and implode, the infamous tulip mania. Picture this. You walk into a pub in 1636. You're just a regular Dutch citizen, maybe a baker or a cheese merchant. A man next to you offers to sell you a tulip bulb. Not a bouquet, just one bulb. The price? The same as your house. And the crazy part, you consider it. Welcome to Tulip Mania, the fever dream of early capitalism, possibly the world's first recorded financial bubble. The Dutch didn't invent flowers, of course, but they perfected the art of monetizing them. Tulips, especially the rare striped varieties caused by a virus that oddly made them more desirable, became status symbols. Owning a unique tulip bulb was like driving a Ferrari today, except you had to dig it out of the dirt and hope no one accidentally made soup out of it. At first it was just wealthy collectors dabbling, but soon everyone wanted it. Farmers, barbers, chimney sweeps. If you could hold a coin and had a pulse, you were speculating in tulips. Entire savings were spent. Futures contracts were created. People traded rights to bulbs that hadn't even bloomed yet. It wasn't about flowers anymore. It was about flipping a promise before the petal ever showed. For a brief, dazzling moment, tulips were the Bitcoin of the 17th century. Then came the crash on February 1st day in 1637. People stopped buying. Maybe they blinked and realized they were mortgaging homes for plants. Maybe someone actually saw a tulip and thought, wait, that's it? Prices collapsed, fortunes vanished, and suddenly that one bulb you paid the price of a canal house for. Worthless. You might as well plant it and try to enjoy the view. Strangely enough, the Dutch economy didn't fully collapse with the tulip market. It was embarrassing, yes. There were lawsuits. There were public sermons about greed and vanity. But the Republic shrugged, dusted off its doublets, and moved on. It wasn't their last brush with speculative mania, just the prettiest one. Tulip mania became a moral tale about hubris, irrational markets, and the human tendency to chase beauty until it bites. But while the bulbs rotted, the Dutch spirit didn't, because just around the corner, the Republic was building a cultural empire on books, maps, and ideas, and that's where we head next. While tulips were being traded like gold and Vermeer was busy painting women doing very quiet things near windows, something else was quietly blossoming in the Dutch Republic, the mind. The Dutch didn't just ship goods, they shipped ideas, and in the 17th century that was dangerous business. Let's start with printing presses. At a time when publishing the wrong opinion in, say, Spain could get uniquely burned at the stake, the Netherlands became a haven for writers, philosophers, and rebels with quills. The Dutch had a relatively tolerant attitude toward free thought, at least as long as it didn't mess with trade, which meant books flowed out of Amsterdam like wine at a merchant banquet. Ideas banned elsewhere found safe harbor here. Descartes wrote and published in the Netherlands. Baruch Spinoza, the excommunicated Jewish philosopher who suggested that maybe God wasn't an old man in the sky, but something more like reality itself, lived and thought here in relative peace until he became too radical, even for the radicals. Universities like Leiden and Utrecht became intellectual magnets. Students from across Europe came to study everything from law and medicine to the latest theories in optics and anatomy. And because this was the Dutch, they studied in buildings clean enough to eat off and catalog their knowledge with terrifying precision. Cartography also thrived. Dutch mapmakers like Joan Leo were not just sketching coastlines, they were redrawing the European imagination. Their atlases were masterpieces, decorative, wildly inaccurate in parts, but astonishingly detailed for their time. Want to explore the coast of Java or dream about Brazil? Just open in a Dutch map. This intellectual curiosity wasn't limited to scholars. The middle class read voraciously pamphlets, travelogues, scientific treatises, and scandalous poetry. Newspapers circulated stories from Constantinople to the New World. For the first time in European history, literacy wasn't a luxury. It was a lifestyle. But it wasn't all enlightenment and espresso. These ideas stirred the pot. Religious tensions simmered. Philosophers were censored. Some books were quietly banned. The Dutch tolerated a lot. But even tolerance has its limits when profits start messing with property law. Still, for a republic of just a few million people, the Dutch punched far above their weight in shaping modern thought. And speaking of shaping next, we turn to the architectural boom that transformed their cities into Baroque Lego sets of brick canals and proud gables. Imagine a city built like a painting. Straight lines, soft curves, and everything in its proper place, even the ducks. That was Amsterdam in the 17th century, a masterpiece of urban design brought to life by engineers, merchants, and a stubborn refusal to let water win. The Dutch didn't just build cities. They drained them into existence. Much of the land the Republic stood on was technically underwater, or had been recently persuaded not to be. With dikes, pumps, and sheer willpower, the Dutch reshaped their world. Where other nations saw swamp, they saw potential real estate. At the heart of this watery miracle was the canal ring of Amsterdam, known as the Grachtengordel. It was elegant, efficient, and about as close as urban planning gets to poetry. Concentric canals carved the city into districts. Goods moved by boat, not cart. Rich merchants built narrow houses with steep steps and grand windows, showing off just enough wealth to impress, but not enough to look French. Those tall houses with the ornate gables. They weren't just aesthetic choices, they were tax strategies. Property taxes were based on width, not height, so people built upward, not outward, squeezing luxury into vertical elegance. The result? An architectural skyline that looks like gingerbread real estate and smells faintly of Calvinist restraint. Brick was the material of choice. It was cheap, durable, and made the streets look like a Renaissance Minecraft server. But design wasn't only about beauty. The Dutch emphasized utility. Even their ornate facades had winches and pulleys to lift furniture up through windows. Since spiral staircases inside were less stately and more claustrophobic, public buildings also bloomed. Town halls, way houses, guild halls. The grandest of them all, Amsterdam's Town Hall, finished in 1655. It was so magnificent that Louis XIV reportedly called it the eighth wonder of the world and promptly copied it, as was his habit. And amid all this architectural splendor, there was a message. The Dutch Republic wasn't about kings or cathedrals. It was about cities, citizens, and civic pride. Clean streets, tidy facades, order, and elegance. This was a built environment that reflected a national mindset, precise, practical, and quietly proud. But beneath this order, tensions simmered. Political divisions, religious strife, and international rivals were gathering. In the next chapter, we dive into the conflicts, internal and external, that would test the very seams of this Golden Republic. For all its brilliance, the Dutch Golden Age wasn't some utopia of harmony and polite cheese tasting. Behind the tulips and oil paintings lay a republic built on tension, political, religious, and increasingly military. First, the politics. The Dutch Republic wasn't really a republic in the modern sense. It was a jigsaw puzzle of provinces, each jealously guarding its rights like a toddler hoarding snacks. The real power lay with the wealthy merchant class in cities like Amsterdam and Leiden. These men weren't nobles, but they had the money to pretend. At the top of the political pyramid was the stadtholder, usually from the House of Orange, a military leader with just enough power to make everyone nervous. Think of him as a monarch with a disclaimer. Some provinces liked him, others liked him less. The result? A constant tug of war between centralized leadership and provincial independence. A sort of political group project where half the group wants to fire the leader and the other half is the leader's cousin. Religiously, the Dutch had technically broken with Catholicism. But that didn't mean unity. The Calvinists were in charge, and they weren't exactly famous for their open-mindedness. Other Protestants, Jews and Catholics were tolerated, as long as they didn't cause a fuss, build big churches, or throw parades. Publicly, everything was orderly. Privately, it was tense. Internationally, the Dutch were suddenly a major power, and the old guard didn't like that. The English, once their Protestant pals, now saw them as economic rivals. Cue the Anglo-Dutch Wars, a series of naval brawls where both sides lost ships, pride, and occasionally their tempers. The Dutch held their own thanks to admirals like Michel de Ruyter, who was equal parts pirate, strategist, and national hero. He once sailed up the Thames and stole the English flagship for fun. But warfare is expensive, maintaining fleets, defending trade routes, and bribing neighbors not to attack. All this added strain to a delicate system. And while the Dutch could juggle commerce, culture, and colonies, they couldn't juggle forever. The cracks in the Golden Age had begun to show, not in the art or the architecture, but in the very system that built it. Next, we'll visit the twilight of this era and ask, how does a Golden Age end? With a crash, a war, or simply a yawn from history? Golden Ages don't typically end with explosions. More often, they fade quietly, awkwardly, like a party where the best guests have already left and someone just knocked over the wine. The Dutch Republic in the late 1600s wasn't collapsing. It was sighing. The signs were subtle at first. Trade remained strong, but competitors were catching up. The English and French were getting better at naval warfare, and even better at copying Dutch business models. The English created their own East India Company, threw in some colonial ambition, and added the one thing the Dutch didn't have, a monarchy with a flair for self-promotion. Meanwhile, France under Louis XIV had grown aggressive, very aggressive. He wasn't content with Versailles and fancy shoes. He wanted borders, power, and maybe a few Dutch cities while he was at it. The resulting wars were brutal and expensive. The Dutch won a few, lost a few more, and bled money throughout. Domestically, the Republic had another problem: boredom. Innovation slowed. Painters stopped painting radical new ideas and started repeating what sold rows of cows, ships, and sleepy windmills. Art became safe. Banking became cautious. The canal houses were still pretty, but the energy had shifted. You could feel the flicker in the oil lamp. There were deeper fractures, too. The divide between a House of Orange and a Republican regents deepened. The middle class, once the engine of prosperity, began to stagnate. Tensions brewed between old money and new ambition. And most importantly, young Dutch people stopped believing they were at the center of the world because they weren't anymore. The final blow came not as a single disaster, but as a shift in wind. The Age of Enlightenment was dawning elsewhere. Britain took the crown as the world's financial and naval superpower. France stole the stage in art and science until the guillotine got involved, and the Dutch, once the marvel of Europe, found themselves quietly edged out of the spotlight. But the legacy of the Dutch Golden Age never disappeared. It lived on in libraries and galleries, in legal codes and shipping routes. The world they helped shape didn't forget them. They just stopped being the main character. Next, in our final chapter, we explore the lasting impact of this remarkable era and how a tiny republic changed the course of the modern world. Though the curtain fell on the Dutch Golden Age, its echoes have never truly stopped. The 17th century republic might have lost its global dominance, but it left fingerprints on everything from economics to art to how we imagine freedom itself. Let's start with capitalism. The Dutch didn't invent money, trade, or greed, but they streamlined them with breathtaking efficiency. They created the world's first stock exchange, pioneered shareholder capitalism, and made financial instruments that are still used today. If you've ever cursed your mutual fund or stared blankly at a line graph, you have Dutch merchants to thank. They also revolutionized global commerce, not just through ships, but through systems, insurance, record-keeping, double-entry bookkeeping, all sharpened to near perfection in Amsterdam. And while they certainly weren't saints, hello colonialism, they were logistical geniuses. They made trade scalable, predictable, global in the arts. Their influence is immortal. Vermeer's quiet light, Rembrandt's stormy faces, the intimate realism of domestic scenes. These became the visual grammar of Western art. Their paintings taught us that greatness didn't require gods and swords. Sometimes it was a woman pouring milk, caught in a moment of stillness. In ideas, they carved out a space for reason. The Dutch tolerance, imperfect but notable, allowed thinkers like Spinoza and Descartes to publish works that would have been burned elsewhere. In doing so, they helped push Europe toward the Enlightenment. Freedom of thought, religious pluralism, scientific curiosity all took root in the Dutch soil. Even their cities set a standard. Amsterdam's canals, Utrecht's universities, the brick gables and clean, navigable streets all served as templates for modern urban life. Order without opulence, function dressed in elegance. They didn't build for kings, they built for citizens. And perhaps that's the heart of it. The Dutch Golden Age wasn't about empires or cathedrals or divine right. It was about what's small. A determined soggy republic could achieve with brains, grit, and slightly obsessive bookkeeping. It didn't last forever. Golden ages never do. But in the brief glow of that century, the Dutch showed the world a new model of success, one powered not by royalty, but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Thanks to them, the modern world sails in their wake, charting new waters on maps they helped draw. Forget stadiums, sponsorship deals, and national anthems. The very first Olympic Games had none of that. No referees in polos, no timers, no slow-motion replays, just dust, sweat, and a sacred olive tree. The year was 776 BCE, and the location was Olympia, a quiet religious sanctuary in the Peloponnese dedicated to none other than Zeus himself, the king of the gods, champion of lightning bolts and apparent enthusiast for athletic thighs. But these weren't just local games to pass the time between harvests. They were sacred, religious even. The ancient Greeks didn't separate worship from physical excellence. In their eyes, competing naked in the heat of the Greek sun wasn't just showing off. It was divine devotion. To test the limits of your body in front of Zeus was the ultimate offering. One far more acceptable than sacrificing goats or writing hymns in hexameter. The origins of the games are a mythological mess. Some say Hercules founded them after cleaning out the orgy and stables, which frankly sounds like the sort of event you'd want to turn into something else. Others say King Pelops. Yes, the same guy with the cursed descendants started them after winning a chariot race. But whatever the story, by 776 BCE, the games were official, recorded, and already prestigious. The first recorded event, the Stadion, a short foot race roughly 600 feet long, or once stayed. The only known victor that year was a cook named Coroibos of Elis. That's right, the first Olympic champion was a guy who probably trained by running between kitchens and slicing goat meat. He didn't get a trophy. He got an olive wreath, eternal glory, and the right to have poems written about his thighs. All competitors were Greek, male, and citizens. No women were allowed to compete or even watch unless they were priestesses. Married women caught sneaking and risked being hurled off a cliff, which feels a bit extreme, even by ancient standards. But despite the simplicity, the stakes were enormous. To win an Olympia wasn't just a personal triumph. It brought glory to your polis, your city-state. You were no longer just a man. You were a hero. And heroes in ancient Greece lived forever. The first Olympic Games may have started with a single foot race, but things escalated quickly. What began as one guy sprinting 600 feet turned into a sprawling schedule of events that tested every aspect of the male body. Speed, strength, balance, and how well you could fight someone half covered in olive oil. Let's begin with the basics running. After the stadium, more races were added. The Diolos was essentially the ancient 400-meter dash, one length of the track there, one back. Then came the Dolichos, a long-distance race that could last up to 24 laps. That's over 5 kilometers in the Greek summer sun, naked. No water breaks, no music playlists, just you, your feet, and probably some very uncomfortable dust. But it wasn't all about speed. The Greeks adored combat sports, and their games reflected that wrestling or pale was a technical affair. No biting or eye gouging, but pretty much everything else was fair game. You had to throw your opponent to the ground 3 times to win. It was the cerebral cousin of the far more chaotic pancration, a mix of boxing and wrestling where almost anything went. Punches, kicks, chokes. It was violent, raw, and beloved. Try not to kill your opponent, at least not in front of the judges. Boxing, called pygmatia, was brutal. No gloves, just leather straps wrapped around knuckle. Matches often ended in blood and broken bones, and surrender was the only way out. It was less like a butterfly and more about surviving with your teeth. Then there was the pentathlon, a 5-event spectacle for the ultimate all-rounder. It included running, wrestling, long jump, javelin, and discus. The long jump was done with weights called halteres, supposedly to add momentum, which sounds more like a tripping hazard than an athletic boost. And finally, chariot racing. Held in the hippodrome, it was fast, dangerous, and occasionally fatal. The interesting twist? The owners of the horses won the prize, not the drivers. So some aristocrat could pay a stable boy to risk his life for glory and still take home the olive wreath. Classic. Each event pushed men to their limits, and sometimes past them. But they weren't competing for gold or money. They were chasing something even more valuable in ancient Greece. Kleos, eternal fame. To the ancient Greeks, the Olympic Games weren't just about flexing your glistening biceps in front of the crowd. They were, first and foremost, an act of worship. The athletes weren't simply competitors. They were pilgrims. In Olympia, that wasn't just an arena. It was a sacred site dedicated to the king of the gods himself, Zeus. Nestled in a lush grove called the Altis, Olympia was more temple than stadium. Before a single race was run or a discus was hurled, the sacred atmosphere had to be honored. The most important structure, the Temple of Zeus. a colossal Doric masterpiece that once housed a gigantic ivory and gold statue of the god sculpted by Phidias. It was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and yes, it absolutely loomed over the games like a divine referee. The rituals began days before the competitions. Athletes took oaths before a statue of Zeus Hakios, Zeus of the Oaths, swearing not to cheat, bribe, or bite during wrestling. Breaking that vow wasn't just poor sportsmanship. It was sacrilege. Cheaters were fined, and their penalties paid for bronze statues of Zeus that lined the entrance path, eternal reminders of their shame. And then there were the sacrifices. Lots of them. Dozens of bulls were slaughtered at the altar of Zeus. The smoke, the chanting, the blood. It was all part of a massive communal offering. The meat was cooked and shared among spectators and priests, turning the games into a sacred barbecue on a divine scale. Fire was central to the ceremony. The sacred flame, believed to have been lit by the rays of the sun, burned at the altar of Hestia. This tradition inspired the modern Olympic flame, though thankfully without the animal sacrifice. Spectators, athletes, judges, they didn't just come for sport, they came for religious renewal. For a chance to witness divine favor manifest through human excellence, the air was thick with incense and anticipation. Winning meant Zeus himself had smiled upon you. Losing meant, well, maybe you didn't pray hard enough. And at night, with the contest done and the altars still warm, Olympia glowed with music, feasting, and philosophy. It was worship, festival, and spectacle, all in one. If you were dreaming of participating in the ancient Olympic Games, we hope you were Greek, male, and very, very nude. The games were sacred, prestigious, and about as exclusive as a Spartan wine club. The rules strict, the requirements intimidating, and the list of those allowed to compete very short. First and foremost, athletes had to be freeborn Greek men, not slaves, not foreigners, not even women. The Olympics were a showcase of Greek masculinity in all its oiled-up glory. Competitors came from city-states across the Greek world, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Rhodes, and beyond, but only if they could prove their Hellenic bloodline. Citizenship was more than paperwork. It was a birthright, and without it you weren't setting foot on that track. And then there was the nudity. Competing nude was standard. Why? For one, the Greeks believed the human body, particularly the male body, was the physical expression of divine perfection. Also, it made cheating harder. No secret weapons, no armor, and no hiding behind flashy gear. Just you, your muscles, and maybe a very unfortunate sunburn. Training wasn't optional. Athletes had to prove they'd been preparing for 10 months prior and undergo a final month of supervised training at Olympia itself. This wasn't a casual pastime. It was a brutal regimen of running, grappling, and tossing heavy things until you resembled a marble statue, minus the helpful plinth. Now about women. They were banned from competing, and in most cases from even watching. A married woman caught attending could be thrown off Mount Taipei. Exceptions were made only for unmarried women, particularly priestesses like the priestess of Demeter, who had front row seats as part of her religious office. But don't worry, women had their own games, the Hurrian Games, honoring the goddess Hera with foot races for girls and young women. Fully clothed, of course. Age categories existed, boys, youths, and men. But you still had to be ready to take a punch from someone twice your size, and there were no weight classes. Wrestling a guy the size of a temple column. Tough luck, kid. Zeus decides the outcome. In the end, the games were as much a mirror of Greek society as they were of athletic prowess. Proud, patriarchal, and meticulously regulated. To the casual observer, the ancient Olympic Games might seem like a wholesome celebration of athleticism and divine devotion, but beneath the laurel wreaths and wrestling matches was something far more strategic politics. Because in ancient Greece, everything was political, including who could throw a discus the farthest. The Games offered the perfect opportunity for the often fractured Greek city-states, the polis, to meet, compete, and engage in the ancient equivalent of international PR. Athens might build temples and Sparta might train soldiers, but Olympia, that's where they showcased national identity. Winning an event didn't just glorify the athlete, it glorified the polis he came from. One man's victory was a billboard for his hometown superiority. City-states even funded and trained athletes as a matter of prestige. These weren't amateurs jogging in from the olive grove. They were finely tuned instruments of civic propaganda. Victories were immortalized in poems, statues, and elaborate public ceremonies. Entire cities would give free meals for life to Olympic victors. Because nothing says you represent our greatness like unlimited wine and lamb chops. But the Olympics weren't just for flexing muscles. They were for flexing alliances. Political leaders used the games as a diplomatic platform. Treaties were discussed. Marriages were negotiated. Even military campaigns were timed around the sacred truce that accompanied the games. Yes, the Olympic Truce or Echikeria. This was a formal agreement that all Greek states would cease hostilities during the games so athletes and spectators could travel safely to Olympia. In theory, it was a moment of Pan-Hellenic peace. In reality, it was more of a polite suggestion. Some wars did pause, others simply ignored the memo. Sparta naturally was banned from the games at least once for being two war-happy monuments and dedications at Olympia were also politically charged. Cities that won battles or gained wealth often built treasuries or statues to flaunt their success. The sanctuary became a kind of ancient leaderboard, a literal arms race in marble. Even cheating had political consequences. If an athlete was caught bribing an opponent or falsifying citizenship, their city's reputation suffered, and in the high-stakes world of Greek rivalry, that was nearly as bad as losing a war. Becoming an Olympic athlete in ancient Greece wasn't a matter of signing up and hoping for the best. It was a brutal, lifelong commitment, equal parts devotion, self-denial, and a surprising amount of sand in your undercarriage. You didn't just show up at Olympia ready to run, you had to prove it. And before you even got close to the track, you were expected to survive months of punishing preparation. Athletes trained at the gymnasium, a Greek institution that was part fitness center, part temple, and part philosophy class. The word gymnasium literally means place to be naked, which tells you most of what you need to know. Training was conducted in the nude, not for shock value, but because the Greeks believed in celebrating the human form as a vessel of divine strength. Each city had its own gymnasia, but serious Olympic hopefuls traveled to Elis, the city that administered the games there, under the watchful eyes of officials and trainers, endured a mandatory 30-day trial before the Olympics. No distractions, no wine, no excuses, just relentless exercise and a diet that would make modern athletes weak. Barley, bread, figs, cheese, and lots of olive oil rubbed on the body, not eaten. The trainers, called Peter-tribes, weren't gentle. They pushed their athletes through wrestling drills, sprinting routines, javelin throws, and strength exercises. The Greeks had no patience for slackers. If you couldn't keep up, you were out. And they meant it. Judges actually disqualified contestants before the games even started if they didn't meet the physical standard. Discipline was everything. No gym memberships, no protein shakes, no fans cheering you on from Instagram. Just the grind. Ancient athletes endured punishing heat, strict diets, and grueling repetition, all for a fleeting moment of glory and maybe a lifetime of free meals if they won. And it wasn't just about the body. The ideal athlete was expected to have a sound mind too. Gymnasias were also places of learning where future champions discussed philosophy, ethics, and the meaning of aerate excellence in all things. To compete in Olympia was to pursue perfection. Not just victory, not just strength, but to become something closer to the gods. The sun rises over Olympia. The air is thick with incense, sweat, and anticipation. For 5 days, the sacred sanctuary becomes the epicenter of the Greek world. Pilgrims, poets, merchants, politicians, and pickpockets all converge for the spectacle. Today is not a normal day. Today, the gods are watching. The opening procession is a blend of ceremony and flexing. Athletes, stripped bare and shining with olive oil, march in a line. Spectators cheer, city-states wave banners, and judges called Hellenodikai look on with expressions that say we will disqualify you for blinking funny. The crowd is massive. Tens of thousands cram into the stadium, sitting on stone or dirt embankments, shaded only by the occasional olive tree and a well-placed sun hat. There are no tickets, no assigned seats, and no bathrooms worth mentioning. What there is, however, is noise. Lots of it. Shouts of support, jeers at rivals, vendors hawking wine and honey cakes, and philosophers grumbling about the decline of morals. Then the trumpet blares. The events begin. Runners launch from their marks with no starting pistol, just a loud shout and the tension of 1,000 eyes. Wrestlers grapple in the sand, slipping in the oil and kicking up dust. Chariots race dangerously around hairpin turns in the hippodrome, where crashes are frequent and occasionally fatal. And the Pancration, that's where things get downright primal, choking, twisting, punching, all in front of Zeus. Winners are crowned immediately after their events with an olive wreath from the sacred tree of Olympia. No medals, no podiums, just a loop of branches and the roar of the crowd. But the glory is eternal. Victors are celebrated like war heroes back home. Their names are etched in stone, their likeness carved in marble. And if they're lucky, a poet like Pindar will immortalize their deeds in verse, long, dramatic, an extremely flattering verse. And through it all the divine presence lingers. Offerings are made, bulls are sacrificed. The gods are thanked because every leap, throw, sprint isn't just for fame. It's an offering, a prayer made with muscle and grit. The games are over, the dust settles, the crowds pack up their amphory and head home. But for a select few, those are crowned with an olive wreath. Life is never the same again. In ancient Greece, Olympic victory wasn't just an athletic achievement. It was a full-blown life upgrade. Winning in Olympia meant you didn't just beat other men, you had pleased the gods. And that kind of divine favor came with serious perks. Victors returned to their polis as heroes. Statues were raised in their honor. Poets sang their praises in verses so flowery, they could outshine the gardens of Aphrodite. Some cities gave their champions front row seats at public events. Others offered free meals for life, a far better prize than a medal, especially in a world where dinner wasn't guaranteed. Wealthy patrons lined up to sponsor you. Families arranged better marriage prospects. Children were taught your name in school. And if you were from a small town, you might find your face carved on local coinage. Your abs are immortalized in bronze. But with fame came expectation. Olympic victors weren't allowed to vanish into obscurity. They became symbols, living proof of a city's greatness. Some were sent on diplomatic missions, others recruited as generals. Their bodies had earned glory, and now their names had to carry it. Of course, not everyone handled the spotlight well. Some athletes grew arrogant. One famously tried to dedicate a statue to himself and the gods, only for the people to quietly change the inscription. Others tried to cheat in later games, thinking their reputation would protect them. Spoiler, it didn't. Those caught bribing opponents or lying about their citizenship were fined, humiliated, and sometimes had their names wiped from records. But for the honest few, the reward was Kleos' immortal fame. In Greek culture, Kleos was the golden ticket. The chance to be remembered not just by your children or your city, but by history itself. If you died young, your name lived on. If you lived long, you became a mentor, a legend, maybe even a myth. And that's what made the Olympic Games more than sport. They were a forge for legacy. For over 1,000 years, the Olympic Games blazed like a sacred flame, held every 4 years without fail. Even through wars and plagues from 776 BCE onward, generation after generation of Greeks gathered at Olympia to honor the gods, chase glory, and maybe throw a javelin farther than anyone else. But even sacred traditions aren't immune to time. By the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire had swallowed the Greek world. The games continued under Roman rule, but the original religious meaning began to fade. Romans enjoyed the spectacle. Gladiators, chariots, public blood sports. But the idea of sport as divine devotion didn't translate as well when your emperor thought he was a god. Then came a final blow. In 393 CE, Emperor Theodosius the Thetan, recently converted to Christianity, banned all pagan festivals. That included the Olympics. After more than a millennium, the torch was snuffed out. The temples of Olympia were left to crumble. Earthquakes and floods buried what was once the heart of the Greek world. The sanctuary fell silent. For centuries, the games lived only in legend, their stories passed down through ancient texts, admired by scholars but viewed as a relic of a vanished world. Until in the 19th century, that old flame flickered back to life, inspired by the spirit of ancient Greece and a newfound obsession with classical antiquity. A Frenchman named Baron Pierre de Coubertin decided it was time to bring the games back, not in a ruined temple under olive trees, but as a modern international competition. And so in 1896, the modern Olympic Games were born in Athens, fittingly in the very land where they began. Today's games are bigger, louder, and significantly more clothed, but echoes of the original still remain: the 4-year cycle, the sacred torch lit at Olympia, the ideals of excellence, honor, and unity, and the pursuit of something greater than victory, immortality through achievement. From nude runners in dusty fields to televised gymnastics and synchronized swimming, the Olympic journey has never been linear, but it's always been human, messy, glorious, and ever-evolving. And it all began with a cook named Koroibos, a foot race, and a wreath of olive leaves beneath the gaze of Zeus. The year was 1791, and the United States was less a country and more a very expensive experiment. The revolution had been won, but the war had left behind a mountainous debt. The fledgling government, operating under the shiny new constitution, was broken, and the question on everyone's mind was who's going to pay for this. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury, who didn't just love strong financial systems, he worshipped them. Hamilton believed the key to national strength lay in federal authority and sound fiscal policy. His plan? Consolidate state debts under the federal government, establish a national bank, and here's the kicker: raise revenue through taxes. And not just any taxes, a federal excise tax on distilled spirits, better known as the whiskey tax. To Hamilton, it made perfect sense. Whiskey was widely produced, widely consumed, and let's be honest, drank like water in many parts of the country, especially on the frontier where clean water wasn't always guaranteed. Taxing whiskey was like taxing sunshine. You could count on it. But out on the western frontier, particularly in western Pennsylvania, farmers had other ideas. Many small-scale farmers didn't just drink whiskey. They made it. They turned excess grain into liquor because it was easier to transport, preserved well, and could be used like currency. Whiskey was liquid gold, literally. And now the federal government was reaching deep into their pockets to take a cut. Worse yet, the tax disproportionately hit small distillers, the very people scraping by with homegrown copper stills and a handful of corn. Large producers could pay a flat fee. Small farmers, they had to pay per gallon, and that felt like punishment by the bottle. To these men, this wasn't just a tax. It was a betrayal. The revolution had been fought over taxation without representation, and here was a distant government in Philadelphia telling them how to run their stills. Some called it tyranny. Others called it familiar. The seeds of rebellion were planted, not in the halls of Congress, but in log cabins and backwoods taverns, where the talk turned from frustration to defiance and all over whiskey. To understand why Western farmers exploded over a whiskey tax, you have to understand the frontier mindset. Life west of the Alleghenies wasn't just hard. It was practically medieval. Roads were muddy trails. The news was weak. To travel in government was a rumor from a far-off land called Philadelphia. The whiskey still in the barn wasn't just a hobby, it was survival. Whiskey wasn't merely a drink, it was a currency, a commodity, and a cultural cornerstone. A gallon of corn whiskey could buy nails, pay wages, or trade for a pig. Taxing it felt like taxing breath itself and the federal excise tax. It hit small producers hardest, those who couldn't afford the lump sum flat fee large distillers paid. Instead, they were taxed by the gallon down to the last drop. So farmers resisted, not with paperwork, but with pitchforks and muskets. At first, it was low-key civil disobedience. Tax collectors were ignored. Forms were left unfiled. But then came the intimidation. Officials trying to enforce the tax found themselves on the wrong end of tar barrels and angry mobs. In western Pennsylvania, resistance turned especially fierce. Collectors were harassed, threatened, or outright attacked. One was stripped, whipped, and left in the woods with feathers in his hair. A frontier fashion statement with a clear message: go home. The federal courts issued subpoenas. No one showed. Marshals tried to deliver them. Locals ran them off. By 1793, it wasn't a protest anymore. It was open noncompliance, spreading across counties like spilled mash. What made it worse? Most of these people had fought in the revolution. They had shed blood for independence, and now they were being taxed by a federal government that felt eerily similar to the monarchy they'd overthrown. Didn't we just do this? Was the unspoken and sometimes shouted sentiment. To them, Hamilton's tax was proof that the government didn't represent them. They saw Eastern elites lining their pockets while the frontier paid the price. The whiskey tax wasn't just unpopular, it was a symbol of everything they feared about centralized power. And all the while, the government watched with increasing concern. What began as law-breaking was starting to look a lot like rebellion. By 1794, what began as scattered defiance had evolved into something far more serious, organized, armed, and determined. Western Pennsylvania was no longer just resisting the whiskey tax. It was actively challenging the federal government's right to govern at all. The flashpoint came on July 17, 1894, when a U.S. Marshal named David Lennox and a tax inspector named John Neville, a wealthy former general and one of the few men brave or stubborn enough to try collecting the tax, found themselves in the rebels' crosshairs. Neville had fortified his house, Bower Hill, outside Pittsburgh, preparing for trouble. Trouble, as it turned out, came in the form of several 100 armed men. The standoff began when the rebels demanded the surrender of Neville and any incriminating tax documents. He refused. Shots were fired. By the next day, a full-blown gun battle erupted. Government troops, tax resistors, and locals exchanged musket fire. Neville's house was eventually set ablaze, and 2 people were killed. The message was clear. The frontier wasn't bluffing. In the days that followed, resistance turned into mobilization. A rebel militia of nearly 7,000 men formed around Pittsburgh, calling themselves Defenders of Liberty and channeling the rhetoric of 1776. They began organizing meetings, passing resolutions, and talking about independence. Not from Britain this time, but from the eastern United States. Federal officials fled. Tax offices shut down. Pittsburgh, terrified of being burned to the ground, tried to distance itself from the rebellion. Meanwhile, word of the uprising spread quickly, sparking copycat resistance in parts of Kentucky, Virginia, and even the Carolinas. To many Americans, especially those in government, it was beginning to look like Shays' Rebellion 2.0, but with more guns and better whiskey. What the rebels wanted wasn't entirely clear. Some called for tax repeal, others for Western independence, and a few even suggested forming a new America west of the mountains. One thing was certain, this was no longer just a tax protest. It was a challenge to the authority of the federal government under the Constitution. The rebellion raised a terrifying question. If a single region could defy a federal law with impunity, what kind of union had they really built? By the fall of 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion had gone from a regional disturbance to a direct threat to the authority of the Constitution itself. In the East, elites feared the collapse of federal power. In the West, rebels were talking like revolutionaries. In the middle stood President George Washington, watching his carefully stitched republic begin to unravel at the seams. This was no ordinary law and order situation. It was the first real test of federal authority under the new Constitution. Washington understood what was at stake. If the rebellion succeeded, or if it went unpunished, it would send a clear message. The federal government could be ignored, defied, and embarrassed. So he made a decision that stunned the young nation. He would lead the army himself. Washington became and remains the only sitting U.S. president to personally command troops in the field. For a man who had once stepped down from power after the Revolution, this wasn't ego. It was a necessity. He wanted to show that the Constitution wasn't just parchment, it had muscle. With Hamilton by his side and acting as his ever-enthusiastic second-in-command, Washington mobilized a massive force of nearly 13,000 troops, larger than the entire Continental Army at its peak. Militiamen from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia assembled like it was 1,776 all over again. Except this time they weren't fighting the British. They were heading west to face their own countrymen. Washington rode out in full military uniform, grim and deliberate. His presence was meant to intimidate, and it did. As the army marched westward, the rebels began to scatter. Many had assumed the government would stay in Philadelphia and argue over letters. They hadn't expected muskets, drums, and a president on horseback. By the time the Federal Army reached western Pennsylvania, most of the rebellion had dissolved. Leaders vanished. Local support evaporated. The show of force had worked, but Washington didn't want blood. Once the region was secured, he handed command over to General Light Horse Harry Lee and returned to Philadelphia. His point had been made. The government could and would defend its loss. When Washington's army arrived in western Pennsylvania, they didn't find a battlefield. They found silence. The rebel militias had mostly vanished into the hills, and towns that once brimmed with fiery anti-tax sentiment now greeted federal troops with suspiciously polite smiles. The rebellion hadn't ended in bloodshed. It had ended in a retreat, but justice still had to be served, at least symbolically. Over 150 suspected rebels were arrested, many of them more confused than combative. Some were rounded up for simply being in the wrong tavern at the wrong time. The federal government wanted to show it meant business, but it also needed to avoid looking like a tyrant cracking down on poor farmers. It was a delicate balance in the end. Only 2 men were convicted of treason. Both had participated in the attack on Neville's estate at Bower Hill and were found guilty under the newly minted U.S. laws. And then, in a twist that perfectly captured the political complexity of the moment, Washington pardoned both of them. Why? Because Washington knew something most revolutionaries turned presidents must eventually learn. Sometimes unity matters more than punishment. He had made his point. The law had been defended. The Constitution had held firm. Executing a couple of whiskey rebels might have turned them into martyrs, or worse, reignited the flames of resistance. Instead, Washington extended mercy. It was calculated, yes, but also characteristic of his leadership style. Firm in principle, restrained in action. His goal wasn't vengeance. It was a precedent, and that precedent was crystal clear. The federal government had the right to tax and the power to enforce. For the first time since the Constitution was ratified, the central authority had faced a challenge and passed the test barely. But not everyone saw it that way. For some in the frontier regions, the rebellion confirmed their worst fears that the federal government cared more about Eastern elites than Western farmers. That Hamilton's financial schemes served bankers, not barrel makers. That maybe, just maybe, the revolution had been for nothing. Still, the rebellion faded. The tax remained, at least for a while. But its legacy would ripple through American politics for decades. The muskets were quiet. The rebels had dispersed. But politically, the real battle was just beginning. The Whiskey Rebellion didn't just test federal authority. It exposed deep fractures in the new republic's identity. And at the center of this divide were 2 towering figures with wildly different visions for America, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton, the architect of the whiskey tax, saw the rebellion as proof that a strong central government was not only necessary, but essential to national survival. His ideal America was industrial, urban, financially stable, and respected abroad. The show of force in Pennsylvania was, to him, a victory for order, a win for rule of law. But Jefferson, he saw something entirely different. Jefferson, then Secretary of State, was appalled not by the rebellion, but by Washington and Hamilton's military response to Jefferson and his growing base of agrarian supporters. The government had looked more like an empire than a republic, sending 13,000 troops to confront angry farmers over a liquor tax. That wasn't enforcement. It was intimidation. He feared that Hamilton's vision would create a nation run by bankers, merchants, and elites, the very types who had lounged in London parlors while colonists fought at Bunker Hill. Jefferson's America was rural, decentralized, and rooted in the virtues of the independent farmer. The Whiskey Rebellion became political ammunition. Jefferson and James Madison began organizing opposition to Hamilton's Federalist policies. Their movement, soon to be known as the Democratic Republicans, framed themselves as the protectors of liberty, the Constitution, and the common man. The Federalists, in turn, painted Jefferson's camp as mob sympathizers who turned America into France during the Reign of Terror. The rebellion, in other words, helped crystallize what had only been simmering before America's first political parties. Lines were drawn. Newspapers took sides. The whiskey tax debate became shorthand for a larger struggle between centralized power and local autonomy, between elite control and populist resistance. So while the rebellion was crushed militarily, it lived on politically. It became a story both sides would retell in very different ways. The Whiskey Rebellion may have fizzled on the battlefield, but in the political arena, it lit a fire that would smolder for generations. It wasn't just about whiskey or taxes anymore. It became a symbol, and like most symbols, it was wielded differently depending on who was doing the wielding. For Federalists, the rebellion was proof that the new Constitution worked. After the chaos of the Articles of Confederation, where rebellion had gone unanswered and the government could barely afford ink, this time was different. The law was challenged, and the law responded. The peaceful dispersal of the rebels, followed by orderly trials and presidential pardons, painted a picture of mature, responsible governance. It was power restrained, not abused. To the Democratic Republicans, however, the whole affair reeked of hypocrisy. The revolution had been fought over taxation without representation, and now a federal government dominated by Eastern elites had marched an army across the Appalachians to crush a protest by poor farmers. It felt less like unity and more like occupation. To them, the rebellion symbolized a government that had forgotten its roots. This ideological tug of war spilled into public discourse. Newspapers ran fiery editorials. Political clubs debated the meaning of liberty. Was the rebellion a dangerous echo of mob rule, or a desperate cry for fairness from the margins of the republic? Even the word rebellion became contested. Federalists insisted it was a treasonous insurrection. Democratic Republicans called it civil disobedience. In time, the events of 1794 became less about what happened and more about what it meant, and looming over all of it was the Constitution itself. The Whiskey Rebellion was the first moment the federal government tested its new legal framework against real resistance and survived. It proved that the balance of federal and state power was not just theoretical. It could be enforced. But it also highlighted a reality the founders couldn't ignore. Not everyone experienced the Constitution the same way. For the elites in Philadelphia, it was protection. For the farmers of western Pennsylvania, it was an intrusion. After the smoke cleared and Washington's army marched home, the frontier returned to its usual rhythm of hard labor, hard weather, and hard liquor. The rebellion was over, at least officially, but the echoes didn't fade quickly, and neither did the resentment. Though the federal government had made its point, enforcement of the whiskey tax remained a mess. Collectors were still afraid to show their faces in the western counties. Revenue was minimal. In some regions, the tax was still completely ignored. The law existed on paper, but not in practice. And that was the irony. After all the drama, the military show of force, and the high-minded speeches about national authority, the whiskey tax barely worked. Even Alexander Hamilton, policy's architect, began to realize it wasn't worth the cost. It had created massive political backlash, helped birth an opposition party, and stirred up anti-federal sentiment that would haunt the Federalists for years, all for a tax that didn't even bring in much revenue. Not exactly a win. Meanwhile, public opinion was shifting. The frontier wasn't just some backwards outlier. It was growing fast. More settlers were heading west. The idea of a centralized government taxing frontier livelihoods began to seem less like governance and more like a grudge. When Thomas Jefferson won the presidency in 1800, ushering in the first peaceful transfer of power between rival political parties, he brought with him a very different philosophy. Where Hamilton had sought to build federal strength, Jefferson wanted to minimize government intrusion, especially on small farmers, and one of his first acts as president, repealing the whiskey tax. By 1802, it was gone, just like that. The controversial tax that had sparked rebellion, shaped early political identity, and sent George Washington riding into battle disappeared quietly with a few strokes of pen. No riots, no flames. Just a quiet admission that sometimes power isn't worth the fight. The law had held, Yes, but the people had spoken too. And for all its symbolism, the whiskey tax ultimately proved how fragile federal authority could be when it ignored the lives of those on the margins. In our final chapter, we'll reflect on the long-term legacy of the Whiskey Rebellion and how it still echoes in today's debates over government power and protest. The muskets are long silent, the barrels empty, tax repeal, but the legacy of the Whiskey Rebellion still lingers, aged like the liquor that sparked it. At first glance, it may seem like a footnote in the vast story of the early republic. A regional dispute, a tax gone wrong, a brief flicker of armed protest. But look closer, and you'll see a moment that encapsulates a profound national dilemma. Who holds power, and how far will people go to resist it? The rebellion forced the country to answer uncomfortable questions. Could the federal government enforce its laws? Yes. But would doing so fracture the very unity it sought to preserve? Also, yes. It highlighted the delicate balance between law and liberty and showed that a republic doesn't run on paper alone. It runs on perception, participation, and trust. Washington's decision to ride out with the army wasn't just a flex. It was an act of symbolism, a demonstration that the Constitution was more than ink and ideals. But Jefferson's later repeal of the tax showed the flip side of that coin. Federal power must also listen, not just lead. In that tension between enforcement and empathy lies the DNA of American politics. Over time, the Whiskey Rebellion became a case study in governance. Scholars cite it when discussing federal authority, the limits of protest, or the birth of American political parties in modern debates about taxation, rural disenfranchisement, and federal overreach. They echo this story with eerie familiarity, even culturally. The rebellion remains potent. It's the only time a sitting U.S. president led troops in the field. It sparked political movements, shifted national dialogue, and challenged the boundaries of dissent in a young democracy. In many ways, the rebellion wasn't about whiskey at all. It was about who gets heard when the government makes decisions that affect everyday lives. Today, the story of the Whiskey Rebellion serves as both warning and reminder that even in a democracy, laws must earn their legitimacy and power must be wielded with care. The line between governance and provocation is razor thin, and sometimes it runs straight through a glass of corn mash. History may have aged the whiskey, but the rebellion? It still burns.